Grey light seeped into the ward before dawn had properly cleared the London rooftops, finding cracks in the plaster to settle upon the iron rails of Valerie's bed like dust. She woke not to a bell, but to the familiar grinding ache residing in the hollow of her shoulder, a phantom weight heavier than the leaden paralysis of her legs. A rhythm governed the room, the slow intake and exhale of other women sharing this suspended state, yet Valerie felt isolated by the specific quality of her silence, a vacuum where signals of warmth or cold should have risen from the mattress. When the nurse approached, the starch of her uniform rustled like tree leaves, a sound triggering an involuntary flinch in Valerie's upper spine that reminded her she was no longer a person moving through the world, but an object to be turned, washed, and arranged. The nurse adjusted the pillow with efficiency, lacking malice, but offering no comfort. "Time for your wash, Miss Storie," the woman said, her voice flat against the peeling paint. "Best get it done before the rounds." Valerie nodded, the movement small and tight, understanding compliance was the only currency left to spend. In the space between thewirds and the touch of flannel, she felt the ghost of a handkerchief against her palm, a linen square no longer existing in the physical world, yet retaining the sticky warmth of Michael's blood, a tactile hallucination anchoring her to the bed more securely than any strap. She stared at the ceiling where a hairline fracture ran like lightning, mapping a journey she could no longer take, wondering if the rain outside fell on London pavement or the mewed off Deadman's Hill, the distinction blurring in the damp chill. The nurse's hands were cool and rough, scrubbing skins that felt too thin, too pale, as if life had been bleached out during long nights of surgery and fever. Water splashed into the basin, a dull thud echoing in the high quiet. "Keep still, no," the nurse muttered, wringing the cloth with a twist, sending rivulets into grey water. "Don't want you catching a chill on top of everything else." Valerie watched the water swirl, expecting a rust-color bloom to spread, a hallucination signaling deepening trauma, but the liquid remained clear, tainted only by soap. It was a mercy the basin did not show the truth of what happened in the back of the Vauxhall, though her shoulder throbbed with a memory far more honest than clean sheets. The nurse moved to her arms, whipping away night sweat, and Valerie focused on the cloth to avoid thinking about legs lying beneath covers like statues wrapped in linen. They were hers, technically, at her hips and knees, yet they belonged to the hospital no, to doctors prodding with pins asking if she felt anything when she did not. A draft slipped under Theodore, carrying wet wool and stale tobacco from the corridor. "Visitors," Valerie asked, voice raspy from disuse. The nurse paused, cloth hovering over Valerie's collarbone. "Detectives likely, they've been ringing all morning. Superintendent Oliver." The name landed like a stone, dropped into a shallow well. She closed her eyes to shut out the ward, but the smell of tobacco grew stronger, overriding antiseptic sting, transporting her back to the car interior where Michael smoked his player's navy cut and complained about rain. In this reverie, Michael was not dead but merely silent, his presence filling the passenger seat where she now saw only the empty space of her own immobilized form, and she felt the urge to reach for Thegia's stick, a muscle memory fearing and dying in dead, nerve endings of her right arm. The transition back to Theward was violent, a snap of reality leaving her breathless, the nurse's hand pressing firmly against the shoulder to steady her. "Breathe, love," the woman said, though her eyes were on the door. Waiting outside." Valerie told herself she was ready, though certainty felt like a lie constructed from fear and the need to provide an answer, allowing them to leave, letting her retreat into the safety of pain. The handkerchief sensation returned, burning against skin, a warning that memory was not passive, but an active force resisting being shaped into evidence. She looked at the nurse, seeing hesitation in the set of the woman's jaw, the way she avoided looking directly at Valerie's legs, eyes fixed on her faces, if acknowledging paralysis might shatter the illusion of normalcy required to do this job. A constable stood by the window in her mind, blocking the garden view, and Valerie felt surging irritation quickly smothered by exhaustion, realizing these men weighing out here to heal her butto harvest memory, extracting details off that night like teeth from Agile. The handle turned slowly, brass clicking against the lock. "Send them in," Valeria said, words costing more than the wash. The nurse stepped back, wiping hands on her apron, and the door opened to admit the draft smelling of wet wool and stale tobacco, carrying Detective Superintendent Oliver and his constable men occupying space, with confidence a feeling alien in this room of broken things. Oliver spoke with a voice ringing to be soft, a paternal rumble at Tim Tinto's smooth, jagged edge-soft investigation, yet every word he uttered carried the weight of the noose tightening elsewhere. Oliver stepped forward, the heels of his shoes clicking against the linoleum, a sharp, percussive rhythm that countered the slow drip of the tap in the corner. He did not sit immediately, preferring to stand at the foot of the bed where he could look down at her without confronting the blanket that hid her lower half. "Miss Storie," he said, and the title felt formal, a shield against the intimacy of her suffering. "I know this is difficult. We wouldn't be here if there were another way." Valerie kept her eyes on his hands. They were broad, red-knuckled, resting on the leather folder he held against his thigh. There was a nick on the thumb, a white crescent of healed skin that caught the light. She wondered if he had cut himself on paper or on something sharper, something belonging to the street. "Difficult doesn't cover it," she said. Her voice was thin, scraped raw from disuse, but it held. "You want me to look at men again." "I want you to look at the right man." Oliver moved then, pulling the wooden chair closer to the bedside. The legs scraped against the floor, a shriek that made Valerie flinch, her shoulder muscles tightening under the thin cotton of her gown. He placed the folder on the locker, the thud vibrating through the metal frame and into her bones, a physical reminder that the outside world continued its bureaucratic churn while she remained stationary. "Justice requires certainty, Valerie. You know that better than most." She did not answer. The nurse had left the room, retreating to the safety of the corridor, leaving Valerie alone with the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco that clung to Oliver's coat. It was a scent that belonged to the road, to the Vauxhall, to Michael. It invaded the sterile air of the ward, claiming the space around her bed as crime scene territory. The constable remained by the window. He was younger than Oliver, his face smooth and unlined, lacking the weathered map of experience that marked the superintendent's skin. He stood with his back to the glass, blocking the view of the garden where the rain was turning the leaves to brown pulp. Valerie felt a surge of irritation that was quickly smothered by exhaustion, a hot flash of anger at having her light stolen, at having her world narrowed to the four walls of this room and the two men occupying it. "Is it necessary for him to stand there?" she asked, nodding towards the constable. Oliver glanced back, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he masked it with that paternal rumble. "Protocol, Miss Storie, just protocol. Protocol blocks the sun." "He'll move." Oliver waved a hand, dismissive, and the constable shifted a foot to the left, allowing a sliver of grey light to fall across the bedsheet. It wasn't much, but it was something. Valerie focused on that sliver, watching the dust motes dance in the beam, anything to avoid looking at Oliver's eyes. She noticed how he avoided looking directly at her legs, his gaze fixed on her face, as if acknowledging her paralysis would shatter the illusion of normalcy he required to do his job. To him, she was a witness, not an invalid, a tool, not a woman. "We have a suspect," Oliver said, lowering his voice as if the walls might have ears. "A man named Hanratty, and we need you to identify him." The name hung in the air, heavy and final. Hanratty. It meant nothing to her yet, just a sound, a collection of syllables that would soon carry the weight of a life or a death. She felt the ghost of the handkerchief against her palm again, that linen square which no longer existed in the physical world, yet retained the sticky warmth of Michael's blood. A tactile hallucination that anchored her to the bed more securely than any strap or sheet could manage. "And if I can't," she asked, "if the rain was too hard, if the light was too poor?" "You saw him, Valerie." Oliver leaned in, his elbows on his knees, invading her space. "You spoke to him, you survived." "Surviving isn't seeing." "It has to be." The softness vanished from his voice, replaced by a steel core that reminded her he was a policeman first and a comforter second. "The public needs closure. The courts need evidence. You are the only evidence we have that puts him in the car." Valerie looked at the file on the locker. It was thin, barely an inch thick, containing everything they knew about the man who had shot Michael and left her broken. She realized that these men were not here to heal her, but to harvest her memory, to extract the details of that night like teeth from a jaw. They needed her pain to build their case, needed her trauma to secure a conviction. "I need time," she said. She nodded when required, the movement small and tight, understanding that her compliance was the only currency she had left to spend, though the cost of each nod felt like it was deducted from her own soul rather than their ledger. To refuse would be to invite doubt, and doubt was a luxury the state could not afford. She was no longer Valerie Storie, the woman who liked dancing and driving. She was Valerie Storie, the witness, a role that required her to sacrifice her own psychological wholeness to sustain the narrative required for the conviction. "Friday," she repeated. The word tasted like ash. "Friday," Oliver confirmed. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. The moment of intimacy concluded now that he had secured what he needed. "Rest now, don't let yourself dwell on it." He turned to leave, signaling to the constable, who pushed away from the window with a reluctance that suggested he preferred the shadows to the corridor. Valerie watched them go, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing her back into the ward. The silence they left behind was heavier than their presence, settling over the room like a blanket that trapped the heat and the sound of her own breathing. She stared at the file they had left on the locker. It sat there like an accusation, a physical manifestation of the burden she had just accepted. Outside, the rain intensified against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that mimicked the heartbeat she can no longer feel in her legs. She wondered if the water washing the streets of London was also washing away the traces of the crime, diluting the truth until it was palatable for a courtroom. Her fingers twitched against the sheet, grasping at nothing. She realized that while her body was confined to this bed, her mind was being forced to travel back to the ditch, to the mud, to the moment the gun fired. Oliver's voice echoed in her head, repeating the name, Hanratty. As the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor, the ward dissolved around Valerie. The antiseptic smell vanished, replaced by the interior of the Vauxhall Velox, the odor of damp leather and Michael's player's navy-cut tobacco overwhelming the scent of the hospital. The file on the locker transformed into the dashboard map, folded incorrectly, waiting for a destination they would never reach. Inside the memory, the heater blew cold air. A trivial complaint. Michael had tapped the dashboard with a knuckle, cursing the British manufacturing that promised warmth, but delivered only a draft smelling of rust and old oil. She could see his hand now, the veins prominent against the skin, resting on the gear stick as if it were a living thing he needed to calm. The road unfurled ahead, a black ribbon soaked in rain that refused to cease, the wipers slapping a rhythmic code against the windscreen that matched the beating of her own heart before the shooting started. "Keep your head down, Val," Michael had said. His voice was not a ghost here, it was flesh. It occupied the space beside her, solid and warm, unaware that he was already dead in the timeline of the ward. She wanted to tell him to stop the car, to turn back towards London and the safety of the streetlights, but her tongue was a lead weight in her mouth, useless as the limbs below her waist. The Vauxhall lurched, a pothole, or a tire bursting. The distinction mattered less than the sudden tilt of the world, the horizon pitching sideways until the sky was where the ground should be. Then the light. White, blinding, yet not lightning, but something closer. A flash from the ditch that burned the retina and left a purple scar on the vision no blink could erase. She tried to reach for him, to grab the sleeve of his jacket, but her arm would not move. Nerve endings fired signals that died in the dark of her spine, messages lost in transit, leaving her trapped behind her own eyes, while violence unfolded in slow, jagged increments. The sound came later. A crack like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot, followed by the hiss of steam escaping the engine, a mechanical sigh marking the end of the journey. "Valerie." The voice was wrong, higher, sharper, no tobacco cure it. She snapped back to the ward with a gasp that tore at her throat, the antiseptic smell rushing in to fill the void left by the leather and the rain. The file sat on the locker, brown and rectangular, unchanged. It had not been a map. It was a dossier of death, waiting for her signature to make it official. Her shoulder throbbed, a deep, grinding ache that radiated down to where her fingers lay curled against the sheet, useless claws. "Valerie, you're awake." Nurse Gable stood by the bed, an enamel basin balanced on her hip, steam rising from the water in thin, ghostly ribbons. She was a woman of practical angles, her cap starched into a rigid wing that framed a face devoid of pity but rich in efficiency. She set the basin on the locker, displacing the file with a clatter that made Valerie flinch. "I was sleeping," Valerie lied. "Looked like dreaming to me." Gable dipped a flannel into the water, wringing it out with a twist of her wrists that showcased the strength in her forearms. "You were twitching, legs mostly." "My legs don't move." Muscle memory, nerves firing off into the void. Gable leaned over, dabbing at Valerie's forehead with the cloth. It was too hot, the heat shocking against her skin, but she did not pull away. "Detective Oliver said you're doing well, considering." "Did he?" "Said you're a brave girl." Gable moved to the neck, washing away the sweat that had gathered there during the journey back from the A6. "Bravery doesn't pay the bills, love, but it helps them sleep at night." Valerie watched the water in the basin. It was clear when Gable had brought it, tap water from the sink at the end of the hall. Now, as the nurse rinsed the flannel, the water shifted. A rust-color bloom spread from the center, swirling outwards like ink dropped in milk. It was the color of dried blood, the specific brownish red of Michael's life leaking into the upholstery. She stared at it, waiting for Gable to see it, to scream, to drop the basin. "Turn your head," Gable ordered. Valerie obeyed. The water remained stained in her peripheral vision, a pool of accusation sitting on the metal locker. "Will you be staying long?" Valerie asked. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the authority she had wielded in the car. "Until you're clean." Gable scrubbed at a spot on Valerie's collarbone, the friction stinging, before he added, "Then I've got Mrs. Halloway down the end." "She's incontinent again," he noted, making a mess of the sheets something proper. "Does she dream?" "Mrs. Halloway," Gable paused, the flannel hovering. "She doesn't do much of anything, just stares at the wall, counts the cracks, I reckon." Valerie looked up at the ceiling. The hairline fracture ran above her, a lightning bolt frozen in plaster. She had counted the branches of it yesterday. There were 12. Today, there might be 13. The building settled around them, groaning under the weight of the rain outside, a structure built to hold broken things until they were ready to be released or buried. "The water," Valerie said. Gable followed her gaze. She looked at the basin, then back at Valerie. "It's just water, pet. Soap makes it cloudy." "It's red." Gable's hands stopped. For a second, the mask of professional detachment slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty, a fear that she was tending to something she could not wash away. Then she dipped the flannel again, agitating the liquid until the swirl dispersed. "Rest your eyes," Gable said, her voice dropping an octave. "You've had a long day, and the mind plays tricks when the body's still." She lifted the basin. The water was clear again, or perhaps Valerie's vision had corrected itself, the brain editing out the stain to preserve some semblance of order. Gable turned to leave, the wet flannel dripping onto the linoleum, leaving dark spots that looked like footprints leading away from the bed. "Nurse." Gable paused at the door, her back rigid. "Yes." "Friday. Is that a question?" "It's a day." Valerie looked at her hands, pale against the white sheet, wondering if they would shake when she had to point at the man behind the glass. "I need to be clean by Friday." Gable nodded, a single sharp movement. "We'll see to it." The door closed, the latch clicked. Valerie was alone with the file and the ceiling and the rain that drummed against the glass, a relentless rhythm that measured out the seconds until the trial, until the hanging, until the end of a life that was not hers to take but hers to sanction. She turned her head to the side, pressing her ear against the pillow, listening to the cough of the woman in the next bed. It was a wet, rattling sound, the noise of lungs filling with fluid, a slow drowning on dry land. She closed her eyes. The smell of tobacco lingered in her nose, though the ward smelled only of bleach and boiled cabbage. It was a ghost scent, clinging to the mucous membrane, refusing to be washed away by the nurse's flannel or the clear water in the basin. Michael was in the walls. He was in the crack in the ceiling. He was in the space between the raindrops hitting the window. Valerie moved her right hand, just an inch, dragging it across the sheet. The fabric roughened against her palm. She sought the edge of the file, needing to touch the paper, to confirm it was real and not another hallucination spawned by the painkillers. Her fingertips found the corner. Cold, smooth, real. She pulled her hand back. The skin tingled where it had touched the folder, a phantom sensation of ink staining her fingers. Outside, a car horn blared on the road below, a sudden burst of anger from the city that continued its business regardless of the tragedy contained within these bricks. She wondered if Hanratty was hearing it too, wherever he was hiding, waiting for the knock on the door that would bring him here, to this room, to face the woman in the bed who held his life in her paralyzed hands. The rain intensified. A gust of wind shoved against the window frame, rattling the panes in their putty. Valerie stared at the basin stand where Gable had left it, empty now, metal gleaming under the electric light. She waited for the rust to return, for the blood to well up from the drain hole, but it remained sterile, hollow, a vessel waiting to be filled. She shifted her weight, trying to find a position that did not aggravate the shoulder. The pain flared, sharp and bright, a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still the instrument they would use to close the case. She exhaled, a long, slow breath that fogged the air in front of her face, vanishing as quickly as the memory of the gun flash. Friday. The word hung in the room, heavier than the file. She turned her face into the pillow, hiding from the light, from the water, from the eyes of the dead man who sat in the corner of the ward, watching her sleep. The lock clicked, a small, definitive sound that severed the flat from the street, and Michael turned the key twice, because he always said one turn was for the lazy and two was for the wise. He smelled of rain and player's navy cut, the damp wool of his overcoat brushing against Valerie's arm as he guided her towards the door, his hand firm on her elbow, a gesture of care that felt like an anchor in the shifting tide of the evening. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, though the movement felt stiff, her neck protesting the weight of her own head after a day spent lying on the sofa watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of afternoon light. "Just don't let the draft in," she said, her voice thin, lacking the resonance it usually held when she was well, when she was whole. Michael laughed, a low, warm sound that filled the narrow hallway, pushing back the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of their home since the doctors had delivered their verdict on her legs. He opened the door and the night rushed in, cool and wet, carrying the scent of London's exhaust and the petrichor of wet pavement, a smell that promised movement, escape, a journey to somewhere the walls could not contain. They stepped out into the landing, the linoleum cold even through the soles of her shoes, and Michael took the bulk of her weight as they navigated the stairs, his shoulder a solid ridge beneath her hand, reliable as the sunrise. Down on the street, the Vauxhall waited, a dark shape huddled against the curb, its chrome catching the orange glow of the sodium lamp that flickered overhead with a nervous, epileptic rhythm. He opened the passenger door, shielding the roof with his hand, as if the rain were a physical enemy he could beat back with sheer will, and helped her slide onto the leather seat. The material was cool against the back of her thighs, smooth and slightly cracked near the seam where the upholstery had worn thin from years of use, a texture she knew better than the face of the man who would later sit across from her in a courtroom and ask her to identify a stranger. Michael shut the door, the thud solid and reassuring, sealing them inside a capsule of dry air and stale tobacco smoke that hung suspended in the footwell. "Liverpool," he said, sliding behind the wheel, his hands finding the leather rim with practiced ease. "Business first, then we find a decent bed, maybe a bit of dancing if your feet allow." "My feet don't do much these days, Michael," she replied, watching him adjust the rearview mirror, his eyes catching hers for a fleeting second before focusing on the road ahead. "But I suppose I can watch." "You'll do more than watch," he insisted, turning the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared into life, a vibration that traveled up through the chassis and settled in her spine, a hum that felt like vitality, like the promise of a future that extended beyond the next meal or the next dose of painkiller. He pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching over wet gravel before finding the grip of the tarmac, and they merged into the stream of traffic that flowed like a river of red tail lights towards the north. Valerie watched the streetlights blur past, streaks of orange and white that painted the windows in fleeting bars of light, illuminating the dashboard where a map lay folded incorrectly, the creases white and sharp against the green paper. It was a map of England, vast and complicated, showing roads that wound through counties she would never visit, towns whose names she would only ever read in newspapers, a cartographic lie that suggested the world was knowable, that one could plot a course from A to B without encountering the arbitrary violence of a man with a gun. "Did you pack the tickets?" she asked, needing to hear his voice, needing to fill the space between them with the mundane logistics of travel that assumed a morning would follow the night. "In the glove box," Michael said, tapping the compartment with his knuckles, right alongside the spare fuse and that torch that never works. "We are sorted, Val, don't you worry." She didn't worry, not then. The heater blew warm air onto her legs, a dry, dusty heat that smelled of burnt dust and old metal, wrapping around her in a cocoon that made the rain lashing the windshield seem distant, irrelevant, a problem for other people in other cars. She felt safe, encased in the competence of Michael's driving, the way he handled the gears, the confident sweep of his arm as he signaled a turn, the absolute certainty that he was the captain of this vessel and nothing could breach the hull. They drove through the suburbs, the houses shrinking into terraces, then into the open darkness of the outskirts where the streetlights gave way to the black void of the countryside. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of wet asphalt reflecting the headlights, endless and inviting, leading them towards the A6, towards Deadman's Hill, towards the place where the map would end and the nightmare would begin. "Sing something," Valerie said, the warmth making her drowsy, the rhythm of the engine lulling her into a state of suspended animation where pain and fear had no purchase. Michael hummed, a tuneless, happy sound, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the steering wheel. "What do you want, Vera Lynn? Sinatra?" "Anything," she whispered, closing her eyes, letting the darkness behind her lids be comfortable, be safe, be the precursor to sleep rather than the prelude to death. "Just keep singing." He did, his voice wove through the cabin, tangling with the smell of his coat and the heat of the heater, creating a tapestry of normalcy that blinded them to the headlights appearing in the rearview mirror, bright and aggressive, closing the distance with a speed that defied the wet conditions. Valerie did not see them. She was listening to the hum, feeling the vibration of the car, believing in the lock on the front door, the two turns of the key, the promise of Liverpool, unaware that they were driving into a terminus that did not appear on any map, a destination marked only by mud and blood, and the silence that waits at the bottom of a ditch. The car behind them flashed its lights, a sudden, blinding strobe that cut through the interior, illuminating the map on the dashboard for a split second before vanishing into the dark. "Bloody idiot," Michael muttered, his hand tightening on the wheel, the hum in his throat dying instantly. "Can't see a thing in this weather." Valerie opened her eyes. The warmth of the heater suddenly felt cloying, suffocating, as if the air inside the car had grown thick and heavy, pressing against her lungs. She looked at Michael, seeing the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders hunched forward, and for the first time since they had left the flat, a cold sliver of doubt pierced the cocoon of their safety. "Michael!" "It's nothing," he said, but his voice had changed, losing its lightness, becoming flat and hard. "Just a fool in a hurry." He slowed the car, pulling towards the left-hand side of the road, the tires crunching on the verge as he made space for the vehicle behind to pass. The headlights in the mirror grew larger, swallowing the reflection of the road, filling the glass with a white, blinding glare that erased the world outside the car. Then the other car pulled alongside. The Vauxhall shuddered as the other vehicle bumped the verge, metal kissing metal, with a grind that set Valerie's teeth on edge. It was not a polite overtaking. It was a shoving match, a deliberate crowding that forced Michael to wrestle the steering wheel to keep them from sliding into the ditch. Rain sheeted across the windscreen, the wipers thrashing uselessly against the deluge, smearing the world into a watery grey smear where up and down lost their meaning. "Stay put," Michael said, his voice stripped of the earlier warmth, leaving only a brittle command. He killed the engine. The sudden absence of the motor's drone made the rain sound louder, a roaring static that filled the cabin. Valerie twisted in her seat, the leather creaking under her weight, and peered through the side window. The other car, a dark saloon she could not identify in the gloom, had stopped parallel to them, blocking any retreat. A door opened. A figure emerged, not with the swagger of a thief, but with the calm, measured pace of a man checking a puncture. He wore a raincoat that drank the light, the collar turned up against the wind, and he held something in his hand that looked like a length of iron until the streetlight from a distant farm caught the barrel. A pistol. The realization did not arrive as a thought, but as a physical contraction in Valerie's stomach, a cold knot tightening below her ribs. Michael was already out of the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the hollow night. He stood between the stranger and the Vauxhall, his silhouette broad and defiant against the headlights of the intruder's vehicle. He said something, words that the wind tore away before they could reach Valerie's ears, a gesture of reasonable men sorting out a misunderstanding on a lonely road. He raised a hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace that meant nothing to a man who had driven miles to find them. The stranger did not answer. He simply raised the gun, the movement economical and practiced, devoid of anger or hesitation. Michael, Valerie whispered, the name barely escaping her lips, trapped by the glass that separated her from the air outside. She fumbled with the window handle, the chrome slippery under her sweating palm, needing to shout, to warn him, to pull him back into the safety of the steel cage. The mechanism jammed, rusted or warped by the damp, refusing to yield. Outside, the world narrowed to the space between the two men. The rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, drumming on the roof of the car, masking the sound of the stranger's footsteps as he shifted his weight. Michael took a step forward, perhaps to grab the weapon, perhaps to reason, his body language screaming a confidence that belonged to a different century, a time when disputes were settled with words or fists, not with cold steel fired from the shadows. The gun barked, a single sharp crack that cut through the noise of the storm like a whip. Michael jerked, a puppet whose strings had been yanked and folded at the knees. He did not cry out. He fell heavily into the mud, the sound of his impact lost beneath the hiss of rain on hot earth. Valerie screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and animalistic, filling the small space of the car until her lungs burned. She threw herself against the door, her shoulder slamming into the lock, but the handle would not turn. Her legs, useless things that they were, tangled in the footwell, offering no leverage, no purchase. The stranger turned. He moved with a terrifying slowness, pivoting on his heel to face the car, the pistol still raised, a black eye staring directly at her through the glass. He did not run. He did not panic. He walked towards the driver's side door, his boots squelching in the mud, leaving deep impressions that would later fill with water and blood. Valerie scrambled backward, her back pressing against the passenger door, trying to make herself small, to disappear into the upholstery. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, beating so hard it hurt. She raised her hands, a futile gesture of surrender, her palms facing the glass, as if she could push the bullet away with sheer will. The man reached the window. He was close enough now that she could see the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, tracing paths down a face that was both ordinary and utterly blank. There was no rage there, no madness, only a cold, procedural emptiness that chilled her more than the draft seeping through the seals. He spoke, his voice muffled by the glass but clear enough to imprint itself on her brain, a flat, nasal tone that asked for money, for keys, as if he were a toll collector and not a murderer. She shook her head, unable to speak, her tongue a dead weight in her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, mixing with the condensation on the window, turning the man's face into a shifting mask of light and shadow. He raised the gun again, aiming not at the door but through it, the barrel finding the gap where her shoulder huddled against the seat. "Please," she managed to croak, the word breaking apart in the dry air of her throat. "Take it, take everything." But he was not listening. The decision had already been made, the calculation completed miles back in whatever dark place he called home. The finger tightened on the trigger. Valerie saw the muscle in his hand flex, a tiny, intimate movement that sealed her fate. The second shot exploded. Pain, white-hot and searing, tore through her left shoulder, knocking the breath from her body. It felt less like a wound and more like a sledgehammer blow, a physical force that slammed her back against the seat, pinning her there. The smell of cordite flooded the cabin, acrid and choking, mingling with the scent of wet wool and the coppery tang of blood that began to bloom rapidly across her blouse. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before, pressing against her eardrums. The rain continued to fall, indifferent and steady, washing over the metal roof, over the broken man in the mud, over the girl who was beginning to understand that the journey to Liverpool had ended before it had truly begun. She looked at her shoulder, at the dark stains spreading through the fabric, and felt a strange detachment, as if the body bleeding on the seat belonged to someone else, someone who had made a terrible mistake. The man outside lowered the gun. He did not check on Michael. He did not look to see if she was dead. He simply turned and walked back to his own car, his footsteps fading into the roar of the storm, leaving her alone in the dark, with the sound of her own ragged breathing and the cooling body of the man who had promised her safety. Then a sweep of light cut through the darkness, a beam from a passing lorry that illuminated the ditch for a fleeting second before moving on, leaving them once more in the shadow, unseen and unhelped. Darkness swallowed the ditch again, thick and absolute, the lorry's taillights shrinking to nothing as the engine noise faded into the wet night. Valerie lay still, the only movement the shallow hitch of her breaths, each one dragging air over the raw tear in her shoulder. The pain had settled now, no longer a shock, but a constant, grinding presence, like a stone lodged deep in the joint. She could feel the blood soaking through her blouse, heavy and warm, pooling in the curve of her armpit before dripping onto the leather seat. It smelled metallic, sharp, distinct from the damp earth outside. "Michael," she said, her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the rain. "Michael, get up." Nothing answered her but the hiss of water on the engine block. The car was cooling, the heat from the journey leaching away into the mud, leaving a chill that seeped through the floor mats and into her stockings. She tried to turn her head, to look through the window where he had fallen, but the angle was wrong, the glass too streaked with condensation to see anything clearly. She knew where he was. She knew the shape of him in the mud, the unnatural angle of his limbs. "Please," she whispered, though she did not know who she was asking, "don't leave me here." A car passed on the main road, tires humming on the wet tarmac, a distant rush of sound that did not slow, did not turn. They were on the A6, a thoroughfare for lorries and travelers, yet the road felt deserted, a private kingdom of rain and wreckage. She shifted her left arm, testing the weight of it, and a fresh spike of agony shot down to her fingertips, making her gasp. The limb felt heavy, disconnected, as if it belonged to the man lying outside in the dark. He closed her eyes. The image of the gunman's face floated behind her lids, not clear but suggestive, a collection of shadows and angles that refused to hold still. He had not shouted. He had not sworn. He had spoken like a man asking for the time, a mundane civility that made the violence feel even more obscene. She tried to recall the shape of his nose, the set of his jaw, but the memory slipped away like water through a clenched fist, replaced by the immediate reality of her own bleeding. "Michael, speak to me." The silence pressed in, heavier than the roof of the car. It was not an empty silence, but a filled one, crowded with the things that would never be said, the journey to Liverpool that would never happen, the life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. She thought of the map on the dashboard, folded incorrectly, the creases white against the blue paper. It was still there, useless now, a guide to a destination she would not reach. Rainwater dripped from the window sill onto her neck, cold and startling. She flinched, the movement sending another jolt through her shoulder. Her hand groped for the door handle, fingers slipping on the chrome, finding no purchase. She was trapped not by the lock this time, but by her own failing body. The paralysis was creeping up, not just in her legs, but in her chest, a tightening that made each breath a labor. Outside, the mud sucked at the tires. She could hear the slight shift of the car settling into the soft ground, a groan of metal and earth. Somewhere in that mud lay Michael, and the thought of him lying there, wet and cold, was worse than the pain in her own flesh. She wanted to go to him, to cover him with a coat, to shield him from the rain, but she could not move. She was a prisoner in the cabin, forced to watch the darkness through the glass while the man who loved her cooled in the ditch. "Damn you," she said, the words sudden and sharp, directed at the empty air. "Damn you for stopping." She did not know if she meant the gunman or Michael or God. It did not matter. The anger was a spark in the cold, a fleeting warmth that vanished as quickly as it came. She slumped back against the seat, the leather sticky against her neck. The blood had stopped flowing freely, clotting now, sealing the wound with a crust that pulled tight when she moved. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps only seconds passed. The rain continued its rhythmic drumming, a steady beat that marked the passage of a life she no longer recognized. She thought of the hospital she might go to, the doctors who would poke and prod, the police who would ask questions she could not answer. She thought of the face in the rain, the flat voice, the lack of emotion. He would be caught. He had to be. No one could do such a thing and walk away into the night without consequence. But the night was large, and he was already gone. She opened her eyes again. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, a green luminescence in the dark. She could not read the time, the numbers blurred by her tears, but the light was a comfort, a small point of order in the chaos. She focused on it, letting the glow fill her vision, pushing back the images of the mud and the gun. "Stay with me," she murmured, though the car was empty of anyone but her. "Just stay." A sound came from outside, a shift in the mud, a squelch of boots that made her heart jerk into a sudden, frantic hammering against her ribs. She held her breath, straining to hear, but the sound did not repeat. It was merely the earth settling, or perhaps a rat seeking shelter from the rain. There was no one there, for the gunman had left and Michael was dead, leaving her entirely alone. The realization landed heavily, not as a shock but as a weight, settling on her chest until she could barely draw breath. She was the only one left. The responsibility for what happened, for what came next, rested entirely on her shoulders, the one good one and the one that was broken. She would have to speak, she would have to remember, she would have to describe the face that she could not quite see. Rain lashed the window, blurring the green glow of the clock. She watched the droplets race each other down the glass, merging and dividing, disappearing into the seal. They were free to move, to flow, to escape. She was not. She sat in the dark, the smell of blood and damp leather filling her nose, waiting for the lights that would signal the end of the night and the beginning of something worse. A dog barked in the distance, far away, unrelated to the tragedy in the ditch. It barked again, sharp and insistent, then fell silent. Valerie closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her, knowing that when she opened them again, the world would have changed irrevocably. The car was no longer a vessel for travel. It was a tomb, a crime scene, a witness box, and she was the only testimony left. She shifted her hand, feeling the sticky warmth on her lap, and knew that the stain would not wash out. It would remain, a mark of the night, a physical proof of the life that had been spilled. She would carry it with her, long after the mud was cleaned from the car, long after the body was removed from the ditch. It was hers now. The blood, the silence, the memory, all of it. The rain eased slightly, the drumming on the roof softening to a tap. Somewhere, a siren began to wail, faint at first, then growing louder, cutting through the night with a piercing urgency. Valerie did not move. She did not feel relief. She simply waited, her eyes fixed on the green glow of the clock as the lights swept across the ditch and pinned her in their glare. The mint on his breath was wrong. It clashed with the stale tobacco that clung to the lapels of his raincoat, a cloying sweetness that made her stomach turn over in a slow, sick roll. Detective Superintendent Oliver leaned closer, his elbow digging into the mattress beside her hip, invading the small circle of air she had managed to claim as her own. He wanted numbers. He wanted shapes. He wanted the cadence of a voice that had spoken only 3 sentences before turning a man into meat. "Try again, Miss Storie," he said, the pencil hovering over the notebook like a bird waiting to dive. "The nose. You said it was broad, but was it broken? Did it have a dip?" Valerie pulled air into her lungs, a labor that felt like dragging a sack of wet coal up a flight of stairs. The scar tissue across her shoulder pulled tight, a band of leather that refused to stretch, reminding her with every inhale that her body was no longer entirely hers to command. She looked at the ceiling, at the hairline fracture in the plaster that ran from the light fixture to the window, and tried to summon the face from the rain. It was there, somewhere behind the grey fog of painkillers and shock, but it kept shifting, dissolving like sugar in hot tea. "I don't know," she whispered, the words scraping against a throat raw from disuse. "It was dark, the torch, it blinded me." Oliver sighed, a short burst of frustration that he tried to mask by adjusting his tie. He did not understand that memory was not a photograph kept in a drawer, waiting to be pulled out and examined under a lamp. It was fluid. It changed with the light, with the fear, with the desperate need to make sense of nonsense. He needed a brick for his wall, and she was handing him mud. "Think of the silhouette," he pressed, tapping the pencil against the paper. When he stepped into the headlight beam, was the jaw square, soft? She wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to scream until the nurses came running, until they sedated her into a dreamless sleep where no one asked about jaws or noses or the specific pitch of a killer's voice. Instead, she nodded, a tiny movement that sent a jolt of fire down her arm. She guessed. She took the shape of her own fear and pressed it onto the blank page of his notebook, giving him a chin that might have been softer, a brow that might have been heavier. The guilt of the fabrication sat in her gut, heavy and cold, a stone she would have to carry long after the trial was done. "You're doing well," Oliver said, though his eyes darted to the door, checking for the nurse, checking for the doctor, checking for anyone who might tell him to stop pressing a broken thing. "We just need to be sure, for Michael." The name hung in the air, sharp and brittle. Michael. He was the reason she was here, lying in this sheet that smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage, answering questions that felt like interrogations. He was the silence in the ditch, the stillness that she could not shake from her mind. Using him as leverage was a low trick, one that made her dislike the man in the raincoat even as she relied on his presence to keep the darkness at bay. A shadow fell across the bed, blocking the dull light from the corridor. Nurse Gable stood there, her uniform stiff and white, a syringe glinting in her hand like a small silver weapon. "Time for the morphine, detective," she said, her voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "She's pale, you're tiring her out." Oliver straightened, brushing invisible dust from his trousers. He looked at Valerie, and for a second, the mask of the confident investigator slipped. She saw the doubt there, the flicker of worry that perhaps he was building a case on the testimony of a girl who was dreaming her memories, who was guessing at faces in the dark. He said nothing, just stepped back, yielding the space to the woman with the needle. "Rest now, Miss Storie," he murmured, closing his notebook with a snap that sounded too loud in the quiet ward. "We'll continue tomorrow." The needle pricked her skin, a sharp pinch followed by the immediate, welcome rush of heat spreading through her veins. The pain in her shoulder dulled, retreating to a distant throb. Oliver's face blurred, the edges softening until he was just a grey shape against the white wall. He lingered for a moment, watching her, then turned and walked away, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. Valerie closed her eyes, letting the drug pull her under. The questions stopped, but the guessing did not. In the haze, the face she had described began to solidify, taking on features she had not quite seen, becoming real because she had spoken them into existence. She had given them a man. She had given them a target. And as the sleep took her, dragging her down into the deep, silent water, she wondered if she had just signed a death warrant for a stranger, or if she had finally caught the one who deserved it. The distinction faded, lost in the chemical fog, leaving only the weight of the choice, heavy and irreversible, pressing down on her chest. Outside, the rain started again, tapping against the glass like a code she could no longer decipher. The morphine receded like a tide, pulling away from a wreckage-strewn shore, leaving the raw geography of her body exposed to the cold air off the ward. Valerie woke to the taste of copper and the heavy, dull ache in her shoulder where the bullet had entered and torn its way through muscle and bone. She lay still for a long time, listening to the rhythmic breathing of other patients, the distant clatter of a trolley wheel on linoleum, the low murmur of the wireless in the nurse's station. Her legs were dead weight, 2 sacks of sand stitched to her hips, useless and silent. She needed to move. The urge to see herself, to confirm that she was still contained within the boundaries of her own skin, pressed against her ribs harder than the pain. Using her elbows, she dug them into the mattress and heaved. The friction of the cotton sheets scraped against her back, a rough sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. She dragged her torso upwards, inch by agonizing inch, until she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her feet dangling uselessly above the floorboards. Sweat broke out on her forehead, cooling instantly in the draft from the window. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, each one pulling at the scar tissue across her chest. "Miss Storie." Nurse Gable stood in the doorway, a chart clipped to her breastbone, her expression unreadable behind the stiff white cap. She did not move to help, merely watched the exertion with a clinical detachment that felt colder than the air. I need the mirror, Valerie said. Her voice was a ruin, cracked and dry. You should be resting. Doctor's orders. Please. Gable hesitated, the pen tapping against the clipboard, a rhythmic ticking that measured the seconds of disobedience. She stepped forward, adjusted the pillow behind Valerie's back with a sharp, efficient shake, and then reached for the small hand mirror on the locker. She placed it on the wall where the light from the corridor could catch it, angling the glass so Valerie could see. 5 minutes, Gable said. Then you lie down, I mean it. The nurse left, the door clicking shut with a finality that sealed Valerie inside the room once more. She was alone with the glass. Valerie lifted her head. The reflection stared back, a stranger wearing her face. The woman in the mirror was older, the skin around the eyes drawn tight by pain and lack of sleep, the lips pale and cracked, but it was the shoulder that held her gaze. The nightdress had slipped down, revealing the top of the dressing, the edge of the skin beneath it angry and red. She knew what lay beneath the gauze. A jagged purple line, a permanent mark of the event that contrasted with the smooth, unblemished skin of her face, a dichotomy that mirrored her internal split between the survivor and the victim. She reached up with her left hand, the fingers trembling slightly, and touched the edge of the dressing. She expected pain, a sharp flare of protest from the damaged tissue, but felt only a dull numbness, a disconnect that frightened her more than the injury itself. It was as though the flesh belonged to someone else, a piece of meat grafted onto her frame that had no nerve endings, no connection to the brain signaling fear or hurt. She pressed harder, digging the nail into the skin beside the wound, but the sensation remained muted, distant, like feeling pressure through a thick glove. In the reflection, the shadow behind her shifted. For a heartbeat, she saw Michael standing there, just over her left shoulder, his hands in the pockets of his tweed jacket, the familiar slouch of his stance etched against the white wall. He was looking at the back of her head, waiting for her to turn, to acknowledge him, to say that she was sorry for the ditch and the rain and the silence. She spun around, the movement jerky and unbalanced, her heart lurching against her ribs. The ward was empty. The curtains swayed gently in the draft from the window, casting a long, dark shadow across the floorboards that looked like the shape of a man walking away. There was no one there. No smell of his player's navy-cut tobacco, no sound of his breathing, only the sterile scent of carbolic soap and the damp wool of her own blanket. She turned back to the mirror, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress until her knuckles turned white. The ghost was gone, but the stain remained. It was not on the glass, but in her mind, overlaying the white cotton of her nightdress with a phantom bloom of rust. The handkerchief. She could see it clearly, the linen square soaking up the blood where she had pressed it against her own shoulder in the back of the Vauxhall, the dark fluid spreading through the weave until it was heavy and wet. It reappeared not as a physical object, lost to police evidence bags long ago, but as a tactile reminder that her survival was purchased with fluid that was no longer hers. The rust color seemed to pulse against the white fabric, expanding with every beat of her heart, a visual echo of the guilt that sat heavy in her stomach. She blinked, trying to clear the image, but it persisted, a trick of the light and her own grief that refused to be washed out no matter how many times the laundry staff changed her linens. It was the only thing that felt real when the legal proceedings threatened to dissolve into abstract rhetoric, a physical anchor for a crime that had happened miles away and weeks ago. She let her head drop, the effort of holding it up becoming too much for her neck muscles. The mirror caught the light from the corridor one last time before she shifted, flashing a bright spot onto the locker beside the bed. Something lay there, partially hidden beneath the water jug. A white envelope, crisp and clean, the paper thick and expensive. Her mother's handwriting was on the front, the loops of the letters familiar and comforting, carrying the scent of home that felt like a memory from a different life. Valerie stared at it, her fingers curling into the sheet, unable to reach out and take it. She knew the words inside would be of concern and love, things she no longer felt worthy of receiving, and the distance between her hand and the paper felt like miles. The envelope sat just beyond the reach of her fingertips, a white island in a sea of grey wool. She could not bridge the gap. To stretch for it would mean engaging the muscles across her chest, pulling the scar tissue tight against the ribcage, until the breath hitched and stalled, a mechanical failure she dreaded more than the silence of the room. Her arm felt leaden, not from paralysis, but from a profound, spiritual inertia that anchored her to the mattress. The paper smelled of lavender water and the dust of the hallway at home, a scent so sharp and domestic it made her teeth ache with a phantom hunger for a life that had ceased to exist in August. Inside that folded sheet lay her mother's voice, the steady, reassuring cadence that asked about the weather and the food and the nurses, pretending the world outside this ward was not holding its breath for a hanging. Valerie knew the script. "We are praying for you. The doctors say you are strong. Come home soon." Lie upon lie, stacked like bricks in a wall she could no longer climb. They wrote of recovery as if it were a destination one could reach by train, a place where the legs worked again and the memory of the ditch faded into a dull ache. They did not know that she was no longer a daughter to be coddled, but a vessel to be filled with the state's need for certainty. If she opened the letter, she would have to answer it, and to answer it she would have to lie back, telling them she was sleeping well, eating enough, hoping for the best. She could not tell them that her nights were spent measuring the cracks in the ceiling, calculating how many times a man must swing to break a neck, or that every question Detective Superintendent Oliver asked felt like a finger probing the wound to see how deep it went. The guilt of that deception sat heavier than the blanket. Outside, the rain had not ceased, a relentless drumming against the glass that blurred the London streetlights into smeared halos of orange and grey. The sound filled the pauses in her thoughts, a rhythmic static that masked the distant clatter of a tea trolley in the corridor and the low murmur of two nurses discussing their weekend plans. Their voices were bright, trivial, concerned with bus schedules and the price of meat, belonging to a species that had not stared down the barrel of a gun or felt the hot spray of another man's life on their skin. She was alien to them, a creature of a different ecology, surviving on a diet of morphine and legal strategy while they worried about the damp in their flats. Her hand twitched, the fingers curling inward as if to grasp something solid, but they found only the rough weave of the sheet. The envelope remained untouched, a silent accuser of the normalcy she had forfeited. Beside it, darker and thicker, lay the file Oliver had left on the locker. The manila cover was stained with a fingerprint of grease near the corner, and the edges were dog-eared from constant handling. Inside were the photographs of the dead man, Michael, his face peaceful in a way that seemed obscene given the violence of his end, and the diagrams of the car, the arrows pointing to the bullet holes, the typed statements that reduced a nightmare to bullet points. That file was real. The letter was a ghost. The documents of death took precedence over the letters of life because the dead demanded a voice, and she was the only throat left capable of speaking for them. She turned her head away from the locker, the movement sending a fresh spike of pain through her shoulder that radiated down to her useless hand. The room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in as the afternoon light began to fail, leaching the color from the curtains and turning the floorboards into shades of charcoal. In the dimming light, the rust-colored stain on her nightdress seemed to deepen, spreading outward like a bruise that refused to heal. It was not blood, not really, just a shadow cast by her own mind, yet it felt wet against her skin, a cold dampness that seeped through the cotton and chilled her bones. She shivered, pulling the blanket up with her good hand, tucking it tightly under her chin to ward off a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the ward. Somewhere in the building, a clock struck the hour, the sound muffled by distance and layers of brick. 4 o'clock, the time when the light died completely and the long stretch of evening began, a vacuum of hours that had to be filled with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the ticking of the rain. Oliver would return later, perhaps, or maybe not until morning, bringing with him the weight of the Crown Prosecution Service and the expectant eyes of the press. They needed her to be sure. They needed her to point a finger and say him, without hesitation, without the flicker of doubt that danced behind her eyelids whenever she tried to recall the gunman's face. Was it the nose, the slope of the forehead, the way the light had caught the metal of the revolver? Memory was a slippery thing, fluid and changeable, reshaping itself with every retelling until the original image was lost beneath layers of suggestion and fear. She thought of her father, sitting in the front room at home, the radio playing softly, waiting for a news bulletin that might name a suspect. He would nod solemnly, perhaps make a comment about justice, unaware that his daughter was currently weighing the life of a stranger against her own peace of mind. If she identified the wrong man, the blood would be on her hands, not just Michael's. If she hesitated, the killer might walk, and the rain would wash away the last traces of evidence. The burden was absolute, a yoke of iron that crushed her spine more effectively than any bullet. Valerie closed her eyes, shutting out the sight of the unopened letter and the ominous file. Darkness brought no relief, only the internal cinema of her own trauma, playing the same reel of the Vauxhall, the ditch, the voice that had commanded them to strip. She saw the gun again, the black hole of the muzzle, and this time she did not look away. She let the image burn itself into her mind, sharpening the edges, fixing the details until they were hard and unyielding. There was no room for softness now, no space for the lavender-scented lies of home. The state required a weapon, and she would have to forge herself into one, tempering her soul in the fire of her own agony until she was hard enough to strike the blow they demanded. The rain lashed harder against the pane, a sudden gust whipping the curtain into a frantic dance. In the swirling shadows, the shape of a man materialized again, not Michael this time, but the other one, the one with the voice like gravel and the eyes that held no mercy. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching her, waiting for her to speak his name. Valerie did not scream, she did not flinch. She simply lay there, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and nodded slowly to the empty air, accepting the terrible compact she had made with the dark. The letter could wait. The past could wait. There was only the trial, and the noose, and the long, slow walk to the gallows that she would have to guide him down with her words. She opened her eyes to the gloom, the phantom figure dissolving into the folds of the curtain, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the heavy, suffocating silence of a room waiting for a verdict. The curtain's twitch became a sweep of headlights, cutting the blackness of the ditch with a violence that scraped against the retina. No gentle dawn this, but the harsh, white intrusion of a lorry beam finding meat in the mud. "God save us," a voice boomed, thick with the shock of a man who has stumbled upon a slaughterhouse while looking for a shortcut. Valerie lay where the grass had taken her shape, the damp earth seeping through the thin fabric of her dress, cold enough to burn. She tried to shift, to offer some signal that she remained among the living, but the command from her brain dissolved before it reached her hips. Nothing below the waist answered. A void opened up there, a silent country where no messages arrived. Above the waist, fire raged in her shoulder, a bright, licking pain that pulsed in time with the heartbeat thrumming against her ribs. "Stay put, love, don't you move an inch." The driver climbed down from his cab, boots crunching on the flint verge, bringing with him the smell of diesel and stale tobacco, the scent of ordinary industry clashing with the ruin in the ditch. He knelt, his face a moon-pale blur in the spill of light, eyes wide and darting towards the stillness of Michael's form a few yards away. She knew he looked at Michael. She knew he saw the blood pooling dark on the gravel where the head had rested. "He's gone," she whispered, the words tearing at a throat raw from screaming. "Michael's gone. Not for you to say yet, keep your breath." The driver's hands hovered, uncertain and afraid to touch the broken things before him, for the ambulance is coming, having been wrung from the box down the road. Time fractured. There was the weight, stretching like tar, where the only sound was the idling engine of the lorry and the wind worrying the hedgerow. Then the red glow of the ambulance lights swept the trees, painting the leaves in pulses of bloody crimson. Men in uniform moved with practiced efficiency, shadows against the glare, lifting her onto the stretcher with a coordination that felt impersonal, as if handling cargo rather than a woman. "Easy on the shoulder," one muttered, his breath smelling of peppermint and anxiety. "Legs aren't working," Valerie said, the statement flat, stripped of fear because the fear had been used up in the ditch. "Can't feel them." "Shock'll do that. We'll get you sorted." The lie hung in the air, unchallenged. They slid her into the back of the vehicle, the interior smelling of disinfectant and old wool, a confined space that rocked with the motion of the engine. As the doors slammed shut, the world narrowed to the ceiling panel and the metal rail above her head. The siren began its wail, a two-tone scream that pierced the night, urging the traffic ahead to scatter. It was a sound of urgency, yet inside the box, the movement felt slow, dragging through treacle. She drifted, pain receded into a fog that felt like safety, a chemical distance placed between her mind and the wreckage of her body. In the gaps of awareness, the phantom sensation returned. Her right hand, the one not pinned by the bandage, curled inward. She felt the linen square there, the handkerchief she had pressed against the wound in the car. It was not there, not really, lost to the police evidence bags or the mud of the A6, yet the texture remained against her palm, damp, sticky. The rust-color bloom of Michael's blood seeping through the weave. Pressure holding. Barely needs a doctor. Voices from the front cabin filtered back, distorted by the partition. They spoke in codes she could not decipher, abbreviations for hospitals and injuries that reduced her existence to a logistical problem. Valerie stared at the light fixture swinging above her. It swung left, then right, a metronome counting down the seconds of a life that had been split into before and after. She wondered if they were driving towards life or merely towards a place to die with more comfort. The thought did not bring sadness. It brought a strange, cold clarity. "Miss Storie," the attendant leaned over her, blocking the light. "Stay with us. What's your name?" "Valerie." "Good, keep talking to me. Where does it hurt most?" "Everywhere." "We are nearly there. St. Albans, just hold on." The vehicle slowed, tires crunching over a change in surface, the siren cutting out abruptly to leave a ringing silence in its wake. The rear doors flew open, admitting a rush of cold night air and the bright fluorescence of the hospital bay. Porters waited, trolley wheels locked, faces masked in professional neutrality. They transferred her from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital trolley, the movement sending a fresh spike of pain through her shoulder that radiated down to her useless hand. She did not cry out. The pain was a confirmation. It proved she was still here while Michael was not. "Into theater," someone commanded, the voice echoing off the tiled walls. The trolley began to move, wheels humming on the linoleum, a smooth, rapid glide that felt like flying. Valerie watched the ceiling tiles pass overhead, white squares marching in a relentless procession. The corridor stretched out, endless and sterile, leading her away from the mud and the rain and the ditch where the grass had taken her shape. The lights above grew brighter, intensifying until they burned the edges of her vision, a sterile sun that promised to burn away the shadows of the road. She felt the cold steel of the instruments before she saw them, the smell of antiseptic rising to meet her like a tide. The attendant leaned close, his voice dropping to a murmur meant to soothe, though it sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. "Count backwards for me, Valerie. Start at 10. Her lips moved, but the numbers stuck in her throat, tangled with the taste of blood and diesel. The lights blazed white-hot, consuming the dark, consuming the ditch, consuming the memory of the handkerchief pressing against the wound. The fog rolled in, thick and gray, protecting her from the full impact of what had been lost. 9, she whispered, though she was not sure if the sound left her mouth. The trolley halted. The doors swung open again, revealing the operating theater beyond, a room of gleaming metal and waiting blades. The anesthetist stood ready, mask in hand, eyes focused on the clock ticking on the wall. Time was no longer hers. It belonged to them now, to the men with the steel and the drugs, and the power to decide whether she woke or slept forever. 8, she managed, the word barely a breath. The mask descended. The smell of ether, sweet and cloying, filled her nose, overriding the scent of blood and mud. She drifted down, sinking through the layers of pain and fear, into the deep, silent water where Michael waited, whole and healthy, telling her it was not her fault. An absolution she knew was false, but clung to nonetheless, a lifeline in the drowning dark. The lights faded. The pain receded. The world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing, slow and shallow, and the ticking of the clock that measured out the seconds of her survival. The ether did not bring sleep so much as a dissolution of boundaries. The sweet, chemical cloying of it filled her sinuses, thick as syrup, dragging her down through layers of sensation until the pain in her shoulder became a distant geography, a mountain range viewed from an aeroplane window. 10 dissolved into 9, and 9 into a slurry of sound that might have been 8, or might have been the hum of the ventilation shaft. The lights above, those brutal, sterile suns, began to smear into long streaks of white fire, burning away the memory of the ditch, the rain, the way Michael's head had lolled against the window frame. She was no longer in the ambulance. She was no longer on the A6. She was suspended in a grey suspension, a viscous fluid where time had lost its linear grip. 7, someone said, or perhaps she thought it. The voice belonged to no one she knew, a disembodied instruction from the ether itself. Then the darkness took her, not as an absence of light, but as a heavy velvet weight pressing down on her eyelids. It was a deep, silent water, cold and still, and in its depths the rules of the living world no longer applied. There was no paralysis here, no screaming void where her legs used to be. She stood on the grass of Dorney Reach, but the grass was dry, golden in a summer sun that had not shone since August. Michael was there. He was not slumped in the driver's seat, his skull fractured by the caliber of a stranger's hatred. He was standing, whole, adjusting the collar of his jacket, smoking a player's navy cut with that familiar, lazy flick of his wrist. "You're late, Val," he said, his voice clear, cutting through the fog of the anesthetic. "We've got a long drive ahead." "I know," she replied, and in the dream her voice was strong, unburdened by the tube in her throat or the blood in her lungs. "I'm sorry, I lost the handkerchief." Michael laughed, a sound she had not heard in hours that belonged to a world before the headlights caught them in the killer's car beam. "Doesn't matter, we'll find another. Come on," he urged, noting the engine was already running. He held out his hand. It was warm, solid, real. She reached for it, her fingers closing around his, feeling the rough texture of his skin, the life pulsing in his wrist. It was an absolution she knew, even in the dream, was false. A trick of the chemicals, a mercy granted by the men in white coats who were currently cutting into her flesh to stitch the ruin they could fix. Michael was dead. The blood on the handkerchief was real. The silence in the back of the Vauxhall was permanent. Yet she clung to the warmth of his hand, gripping it as if it were a lifeline in a drowning sea, refusing to let go even as the ground beneath them began to tremble. "Valerie." The voice was different now, sharper, closer. It did not come from Michael. It came from above, piercing the velvet dark like a needle. "Valerie, can you hear me?" The dream fractured. Michael's hand slipped from hers, dissolving into smoke, into the grey fog that rolled in to replace the golden sun of Dorney Reach. He was gone. The warmth vanished, replaced by a biting cold that seeped into her bones. The golden grass turned to white tiles. The summer sun became the blinding glare of the operating theatre lights, hovering directly above her, unblinking and merciless. She tried to speak, to call him back, to ask why he had left her again, but her throat was a desert. Something thick and rubbery occupied her mouth, pressing down on her tongue, triggering a gag reflex that sent a jolt of nausea through her chest. She choked, a wet, ugly sound that seemed to echo in the vast, tiled cavern of the room. "She's coming round, pulse is thready. Give her another quarter, we're not done here." Voices clinical, detached. They spoke of her as if she were a machine being recalibrated, a broken engine laid out on a workbench for repair. There was no pity in their tones, only the focused efficiency of men who had seen too much blood to be moved by any single stain. Valerie blinked, her eyelids heavy as lead shutters, fighting against the glare that burned the retinas. Shapes swam into focus. Green gowns, white masks. Steel instruments glinting on a tray, arranged with a geometric precision that felt obscene against the chaos of her body. She tried to move her legs. It was an instinct, a reflex born of a lifetime of walking, of running, of stepping out of cars and onto pavements. She sent the command from her brain, a clear, urgent signal: move. Nothing. Not pain, not stiffness, not the heavy lethargy of anesthesia. Nothing, a void, a silence so profound, so absolute that it screamed louder than any alarm. It was as if the lower half of her body had been amputated, not by a blade, but by a razor, wiped clean from the map of her existence. She lay there, staring at the white tiles of the ceiling, waiting for the sensation to return, for the pins and needles, for the ache of muscles waking up. But the silence remained. A perfect, impenetrable wall between her mind and her limbs. "Michael," she tried to say. The word came out as a croak, distorted by the tube, barely audible over the rhythmic beep of the monitor beside her. "SHH," a nurse said, leaning into her field of vision with eyes that were kind but tired, rimmed with the redness of a long shift. "You're safe now. You're in St. Albans, and you've had an operation." Michael, she rasped again, forcing the air past the obstruction in her throat. Where is? The nurse's expression shifted. A flicker of something, a pity, avoidance, a circumflex crossed her face before the professional mask slid back into place. She adjusted the drip, her fingers moving with practiced ease, checking the flow of the clear fluid into Valerie's vein. Rest now, love. The doctor will speak with you later. Just rest. Later, the word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Later meant after the shock had worn off. Later meant when the facts had been arranged into a narrative that could be spoken aloud. Later meant when Michael's body had been identified, tagged, and moved to a mortuary slab. Valerie closed her eyes, but the image of the dream lingered, taunting her. Him standing in the sun, her reaching for his hand. The lie of it sat in her stomach, heavier than the ether, heavier than the blood loss. She focused on her right hand, the one not pinned by bandages. It lay on the sheet, pale against the white linen. She curled her fingers, making a fist, then releasing them. The movement was sluggish, but it was there, proof of life, proof that she was still here, trapped in this broken vessel, while the world continued to turn outside the sterile walls of the theater. A new smell cut through the antiseptic tang, tobacco, faint but unmistakable. It drifted in from the corridor, clinging to the green gown of a man who had just entered the room. He stood at the foot of the trolley, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an intensity that felt predatory. He did not wear a mask. His face was lined, etched with the fatigue of a long night, but his eyes were sharp, alert, missing nothing. "Miss Storie," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the soothing cadence of the medical staff. It was the voice of a man who needed answers, not a man who offered comfort. "I'm Detective Superintendent Oliver. We need to talk, not now, perhaps, but soon." Valerie stared at him. The smoke from his cigarette seemed to cling to him still, a ghost of the outside world, of the rain-slicked roads, and the ditch where the grass had taken her shape. He was the first link to the reality she had been trying to escape, the first tangible connection to the crime that had stolen her legs and her companion. "Michael," she whispered, the name a prayer and an accusation all at once. Oliver did not flinch. He did not offer the platitudes of the nurse. He simply nodded, a slow, grim acknowledgement of the truth they both already knew. "Mr. Gregston is deceased," he said, the words precise, clipped, final. "You are the only witness, Miss Storie, the only one who saw his face." The silence in the room deepened, pressing against her eardrums. The beep of the monitor counted the seconds, each one a hammer blow. The paralysis in her legs was no longer just a physical absence, it was a sentence. She was the instrument, the vessel, the thing that would have to carry the memory of the shooter's face so that the state could demand its price. Oliver leaned closer, his shadow falling across her face, blocking out the sterile sun of the theater lights. "Rest now," he said, echoing the nurse, but the command carried a different weight. "We'll be waiting." He turned and walked away, the smell of tobacco lingering in his wake, a scent that would haunt her long after the antiseptic had faded, long after the stitches were removed, long after the trial was over. Valerie lay still, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling the phantom weight of the handkerchief in her palm, damp and sticky with a blood that was no longer hers. The dream was gone. Michael was gone. Only the silence remained, and the terrible, crushing knowledge that she would have to fill it with words. The tobacco scent did not dissipate. It settled, a greasy film on the back of her throat that no amount of swallowed air could clear. Valerie swallowed. The action scraped, raw and grinding like sandpaper dragged over dry wood. She needed water. More than that, she needed the absence of the man who had just named her a vessel, a tool to be sharpened against the whetstone of the law. The nurse was busy at the sink, clattering metal basins, her back turned, offering a sliver of privacy that felt dangerously like abandonment. "Wait," Valerie croaked. The word was small, a pebble dropped into a deep well, barely disturbing the surface of the room's heavy air. The nurse did not turn immediately, continuing to scrub a stain from a steel tray with a vigor that suggested she was trying to erase the night itself. When she finally pivoted, her face was composed, the mask of professional detachment smoothed back into place, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You mustn't exert yourself, Miss Storie," the nurse said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The doctor said absolute quiet. Your throat is swollen from the intubation." He said. Valerie paused, gathering the shards of her voice, forcing them into a shape that might hold weight. He said Michael is dead. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, heavy and final, dropped onto the sterile floor between them. The nurse flinched, a minute tightening of the jaw, before she moved to the bedside table and picked up a glass of water, holding the straw to Valerie's lips. The water was tepid, tasting faintly of the rubber tubing it had traveled through, but it washed away the taste of smoke, if only for a second. "Drink," the nurse commanded softly. "That is all you can do just now. The rest is for others to manage." Others, the word hung there, implicating the man in the corridor, the doctors in their high towers, the unseen machinery of the state that was already beginning to grind its gears. Valerie pushed the straw away with her tongue, a small act of rebellion that cost her dearly in pain. She wanted to scream that there was no one else, that Michael was the only other person who mattered, and he was gone, reduced to a tag on a toe in a cold room somewhere in St. Albans. Instead, she lay still, letting the silence stretch until it became a third presence in the room, crowded and suffocating. Her right hand, the one she had tested moments before, crept across the sheet. It moved with a deliberateness that felt alien, as if it belonged to someone else, a stranger piloting a limb through thick syrup. She reached for the edge of the blanket, gripping the coarse wool, anchoring herself against the drift of the anesthetic that still pulled at the edges of her mind. She needed to feel something real, something that was not a memory or a prophecy of pain. The wool was rough, scratching her palm, a sensory truth that cut through the fog. "They will want to know what he looked like," she whispered, more to the hand gripping the blanket than to the nurse. The nurse stopped her clattering. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of things unsaid, of protocols and procedures that valued information over comfort. She turned fully now, leaning against the sink, her arms crossed over her chest as if to hold herself together. "The police are very keen to help, love," the nurse said, her voice taking on a placating tone that grated on Valerie's nerves. "They want to catch the person who did this. You know that." "Do I?" Valerie asked. The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Or do they just want a name to put on a form? The nurse did not answer. She looked down at her shoes, scuffed white leather that had seen too many night shifts, too many broken bodies. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, a dull gray bruise spreading across the windowpane, signaling the arrival of a morning that felt entirely unearned. The birds were starting to sing, a cheerful, indifferent chorus that mocked the stillness of the ward. It was autumn, yet the air felt thin, stripped of the warmth that should have lingered from summer, as if the violence in the ditch had sucked the heat right out of the season. Valerie shifted her gaze to the door. It was closed, but she could feel the presence of Detective Superintendent Oliver on the other side, waiting like a spider at the edge of a web. He had said soon. Soon meant when she was coherent enough to be useful. Soon meant when the shock had dulled enough for her to construct a narrative that would satisfy the need for order. She realized, with a sudden, cold clarity that had nothing to do with the paralysis in her legs, that her survival was contingent on her utility. If she could not name the shooter, if she could not provide the face that would justify the manhunt, the investigation would stall, and Michael's death would become a statistic, a footnote in a ledger of unsolved crimes. She was the only witness, the only living link between the ditch and the courtroom, the weight of it pressed down on her chest, heavier than the blankets, heavier than the bandages. It was a burden she had not asked for, a role cast upon her by chance, and a bullet that had missed her heart by inches. She stopped, her throat closing up again. She tried to swallow, but the lump of grief was too large, too jagged. "I need to see him." The nurse straightened up, pushing away from the sink. Her expression hardened, the pity replaced by a firm, bureaucratic resolve. "That is not possible, Miss Storie," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Gregston is under the care of the coroner now. There are procedures." "Procedures," Valerie repeated, the word tasting like ash, and then she added, "Yes, everything is procedures." She let her hand drop back to the sheet, the energy required to hold it up suddenly exhausted. The rough wool no longer felt like an anchor, it felt like a shroud. She closed her eyes, shutting out the gray light of the morning, the sterile white of the walls, the judgmental presence of the nurse. In the darkness behind her eyelids, the image of Michael returned, not as he was in the dream, whole and smiling, but as he had been in the ditch, slumped and still, the blood soaking into the earth. She could smell the damp soil, the petrol, the copper tang of blood. It was all so vivid, so immediate, that she wondered if she had ever truly left the roadside, if this hospital bed was just another layer of the nightmare, a waiting room before the final reckoning. A shadow fell across her face again. She opened her eyes, expecting the nurse, but it was the door handle turning, the slow, deliberate click of the latch engaging. The smell of tobacco drifted in again, stronger this time, mingling with the antiseptic to create a nauseating cocktail. Detective Superintendent Oliver stepped inside, his hat in his hand, his face set in lines of grim determination. He did not look at the nurse. He looked only at Valerie, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "Are you ready, Miss Storie?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room, drowning out the birdsong, the clatter of the nurse's trays, the beating of her own heart. "We have a description to take. Time is of the essence." Valerie stared at him, seeing not a man but an instrument of the state, a mechanism designed to extract truth regardless of the cost. She wanted to tell him to go away, to leave her in the peace of her paralysis, but the words died in her throat. She knew he would not leave. She knew that from this moment forward, her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the memory of a face in the dark, a face she would have to conjure from the wreckage of her mind to satisfy the hunger of the law. She took a breath, the air rasping in her damaged throat, and nodded, a single jerky movement of her head. "Get a pencil," she whispered, "and paper." Oliver nodded to the nurse, who moved quickly to the desk in the corner, retrieving a notebook and a stub of pencil. The sound of the pencil scratching against the paper was loud in the quiet room, a harsh, grating noise that signaled the beginning of the end of her silence. Valerie fixed her eyes on the ceiling tiles, counting the holes in the perforated board, 1, 2, 3, trying to find a pattern in the chaos, trying to steady herself before she spoke the name of the devil into the record. "He was tall," she began, her voice trembling, barely audible. "Or maybe he wasn't, I can't. The light was bad." "Take your time," Oliver said, stepping closer, his shadow engulfing her once more. "We have all the time in the world." But they didn't. She knew it, and he knew it. The clock was ticking not on the wall, but in the fading neurons of her brain, in the cooling blood of the man in the mortuary. Every second she delayed was a second the killer ran further, a second the truth slipped further out of reach. She gripped the sheet again, her knuckles white, and forced herself to speak, to weave a picture from fragments of fear and shadow, knowing that whatever she said would become the truth, whether it was real or not. "He had a scar," she lied, or perhaps she remembered, the distinction already blurring in the haze of trauma, on his left cheek, just below the eye. Oliver's pen stopped. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure?" he asked. Valerie met his gaze, seeing the hope there, the desperate need for a solid fact to cling to. She nodded again, the lie settling into her mind, taking root, becoming a memory as real as the paralysis in her legs. "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." The pencil scratched on, recording the fiction that would become fact, the story that would hang a man or let him walk free. Valerie closed her eyes, listening to the sound, feeling the weight of the words settling on her chest, heavy as stone, permanent as death. The birds outside continued to sing, indifferent to the justice being manufactured in the room, indifferent to the life that was being traded for another. She lay still, waiting for the next question, waiting for the next lie, waiting for the moment when she would no longer know where the memory ended and the invention began. The pencil stopped scratching. The graphite tip hovered above the paper, a black eye waiting to blink, while the silence in the room thickened until it pressed against Valerie's eardrums like deep water. She had said the words, "Scar, left cheek." They hung there, suspended in the antiseptic haze, no longer hers, but belonging to the notebook, to Oliver, to the vast, hungry machinery of the law that was already grinding its gears in preparation for the kill. Outside, a bus groaned up the hill, the engine laboring in low gear, a sound so ordinary it felt like an insult to the catastrophe unfolding between the iron bedrails and the washbasin. Oliver did not smile. He did not nod in triumph. He simply stared at her, his expression shifting from the paternal concern of a doctor to the sharp, calculating focus of a hunter, who has just spotted the break in the brush. "You are certain, Miss Storie?" he asked again, though the question was rhetorical, a formality to bind her to the statement before the ink could dry. "A scar below the eye." "I see it," Valerie said, and the lie tasted of copper, sharp and metallic on the back of her tongue, indistinguishable from the blood she still imagined coating her throat. "It catches the light." When he turned, she watched his hand move, the pen darting across the page, capturing the fiction with a speed that made her stomach turn over. He was writing it down as fact. There was no hesitation, no query of doubt, no check against the physical evidence of a body that was already cold in a mortuary slab miles away. The scar did not exist. She knew it with a clarity that cut through the fog of her pain, a sudden, icy realization that she had reached into the dark cupboard of her memory and pulled out a random object just to satisfy the man standing over her. Perhaps there had been a shadow, perhaps a trick of the headlight beam reflecting off a button or a crease in the skin. But now, because Oliver's pen was moving, because he needed a hook to hang the net upon, the scar was real. It was etched into the permanent record, destined to be read out in a court of law, repeated by journalists in the evening papers, carved into the public consciousness as the defining mark of a monster. The nurse retreated to the corner, her back turned as she fiddled with a tray of instruments, the clinking of metal on china sounding unnaturally loud, a deliberate performance of ignorance. She knew what was happening. Everyone in the room knew. They were building a cage, brick by verbal brick, and Valerie was laying the mortar with her broken voice. She wanted to reach out, to grab Oliver's sleeve and tell him to stop, to wipe the page clean and start again with the honest admission that she saw nothing but a blur of motion and the flash of a gun. But her arms remained heavy, pinned to her sides by the weight of her own cowardice. It was easier to give him the scar. It was easier to give them all the details they craved, the neat little packages of identification that would allow them to sleep at night, convinced that justice was a tangible thing that could be caught and held, rather than a ghost that slipped through fingers. "Anything else?" Oliver prompted, his voice softer now, coaxing, like a man encouraging a child to step off a high ledge. The voice, the coat, did he speak before he fired? Valerie stared at the ceiling tiles again, the perforated holes blurring into a constellation of dark stars, each one a witness to her perjury. She could feel the phantom handkerchief in her palm, the damp, sticky warmth of Michael's blood seeping through the linen, a tactile accusation that made her fingers twitch against the sheet. Michael was dead. He was gone, reduced to a name on a form and a body in a box, and he could not contradict her. He could not say that the man had no scar, that the man had spoken with an accent she couldn't place, that the man had looked terrified rather than cold. His silence was absolute, a void that she was filling with her own invented truths. "He wore a raincoat," she whispered, the words tumbling out faster now as a floodgate opened to wash away the guilt. "Dark, maybe grey. And he smelled of oil," she added, "or perhaps petrol." Another lie, or was it? The Vauxhall smelled of petrol. Michael smelled of tobacco and the mint he chewed. The night air had smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. But oil, petrol, it was a detail that fit, a piece of the puzzle that slid neatly into the space Oliver had carved out for it. It made sense. It sounded right. And in the business of justice, sounding right was often enough to condemn a soul. Oliver nodded, a brisk and satisfied movement. "Good, very good, Miss Storie, for this helps us immensely." He spoke of a suspect in mind, a man with a record, suggesting that if they could match the description. He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavy and suffocating in the air. "If we can match this, we can hang him." Valerie felt a shiver run through her, not from cold, but from the sudden, terrifying understanding of what she had just done. She had not just described a man. She had created him. She had taken the vague, shapeless fear of that night on the A6 and given it a face, a scar, a smell, a history. She had built an effigy out of lies and handed it to the state to be burned, knowing full well that the fire would consume flesh and blood, not straw. The pen scratched on, the sound rhythmic and relentless, like a ticking clock counting down the seconds of a stranger's life. "Will that be all?" Oliver asked, capping his pen with a definitive click that echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "You need your rest. The doctor will be along shortly." He did not wait for an answer. He tucked the notebook into his inside pocket, patting it once as if to ensure it was secure, a treasure more valuable than gold. Then he turned and walked to the door, his footsteps heavy and confident on the linoleum, the stride of a man who had a job to do and the tools to do it. The nurse hurried to open the door for him, her face averted, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she feared catching Valerie's gaze and seeing the reflection of her own complicity. "Thank you, Miss Storie," Oliver said, pausing on the threshold, looking back at her with an expression that might have been gratitude or perhaps just relief. "You've been very brave." The door closed behind him, the latch clicking into place with a finality that sealed Valerie inside the room with her secret. The silence rushed back in, filling the space he had occupied, but it was different now. It was no longer the quiet of a hospital ward. It was the silence of a tomb, the heavy, suffocating stillness of a place where something vital had just died. She lay alone, the phantom stain on her palm burning hotter, the smell of imaginary petrol clogging her nostrils, and she knew that no amount of washing would ever clean her hands. The bus outside groaned again, shifting gears, moving on, indifferent to the fact that a life had just been sentenced to death by a paralyzed woman in a bed, a woman who had traded her soul for a moment of peace in the eyes of a detective. She closed her eyes, but the image of the scar remained, bright and vivid behind her lids, a brand she had pressed onto the flesh of a man she had never truly seen. The latch clicked, a small mechanical sound, yet it severed the room from the corridor, cutting off the draft of tobacco and authority that had filled the space like smoke. Valerie opened her eyes. The ceiling remained unchanged, the hairline fracture running its lightning path across the white plaster, indifferent to the life just bartered beneath it. Footsteps approached, not the heavy, confident tread of Oliver, but the lighter, rubber-soled shuffle of the ward sister. The door handle turned without a knock, a privilege of rank, and Mrs. Gable entered carrying a tray laden with fresh linen and a jug of water. She did not look at Valerie's face immediately, focusing instead on the table where the tea things sat cooling, the stained cups marking the duration of the interview like rings on a tree trunk. "He's gone then," Mrs. Gable said, her voice flat, stripping the event of its weight. "You look done in, love." Valerie tried to swallow, but her throat felt lined with cotton wool, dry and abrasive. He needed what he needed. "Always do." The nurse set the tray down with a clatter of china that made Valerie's shoulders tighten. "They think we're made of iron, the lot of them. Police, doctors, visitors. As if lying here waiting for the bits to knit doesn't take more energy than walking miles." Mrs. Gable began to strip the bed, her movements brisk, efficient. She pulled the sheet down to Valerie's waist, exposing the paralyzed limbs to the cool air of the ward. Valerie did not flinch. She had no sensation below the ribs, yet the exposure felt like a violation, a public display of her ruin. The nurse's hands were warm, rough from disinfectant, and as she adjusted the pillow beneath Valerie's neck, she lingered for a second too long. "Did you tell him," Mrs. Gable asked, smoothing the sheet over Valerie's legs, "about the pain, the spasms?" "I told him about the man's." "Ah," the nurse paused, her hands resting on the blanket as she considered the truth. "That's what matters to them, isn't it? Not the broken spine, but just the name." "It has to be a name," Valerie said, her voice cracking into a thin sound that barely reached the foot of the bed. "Otherwise, it's just noise. It is merely a car on a road with no one to blame." Mrs. Gable resumed her work, tucking the corners with sharp, precise folds. "Well, you've done your duty, that's what they'll say. Brave girl survives ordeal, helps catch the villain." She stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Never mind what it costs the girl." The observation hung between them, stark and unadorned. Valerie turned her head towards the window. The rain had started again, streaking the glass with grey lines that blurred the view of the street below. A bus passed, its engine whining in a lower gear, the sound muffled by the double glazing. Inside the room, the smell of disinfectant was winning its war against the lingering scent of Oliver's tobacco, but Valerie could still smell the petrol. It was inside her now, a fume in the blood, chemical and sharp. She looked at her hands. They lay on top of the sheet, pale against the white linen. Her fingers twitched, a nervous spasm that she could not command to stop. In her mind, the linen was not white. It was stained. The rust-color bloom of Michael's blood spread from the center, soaking through the weave, dripping onto the mattress. She clenched her fist, trying to crush the sensation, but the phantom warmth persisted, sticky and wet against her palm. "Will you be needing anything else?" Mrs. Gable asked, picking up the tray of used china. "Painkillers? The doctor said you could have another dose if the headache returns." "No," Valerie watched the nurse move towards the door. "No pills. I need to be clear." "Clear for what?" "For the next time." Mrs. Gable stopped, her hand on the door handle. She looked back, her expression unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality that hid whatever pity she might have felt. There's always a next time, isn't there? Once they start taking statements, they don't stop until the judge puts on the black cap. "Is that what happens?" "You know it is," the nurse said, opening the door. "Rest now, and don't let them wear you down too much, for you're the one who has to live with the view from this bed while they go home to their wives." The door closed, the latch clicked again. Valerie was alone with the rain and the smell of petrol. She shifted her shoulders, trying to find a position that didn't ache, but the pain was not in the muscles. It was in the memory. She had given Oliver the scar. She had given him the petrol. She had built a monster out of scraps and handed it to him on a silver platter, and he had taken it with gratitude. Michael would have laughed. He always laughed at the police, at their pompous uniforms and their notebooks full of assumptions. He would have told her to tell them nothing, to wait for a lawyer, to protect herself first. But Michael was in a box. Michael was cold, and Valerie was here, warm and breathing, and trapped in a body that would not obey her. She lifted her right hand, examining the palm. The skin was clean, unblemished, the lines of her life still visible despite the trauma. There was no blood, there was no stain, yet the weight of the handkerchief remained, a physical burden that dragged her wrist down towards the mattress. She tried to shake it off, a quick flick of the wrist, but the sensation was anchored in the nerve endings, a ghost limb of guilt attached to a living hand. Outside, the bus groaned again, changing gears as it climbed the hill. The sound faded, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of a tap in the washroom down the hall. Drip, drip, drip. A metronome counting out the seconds until the next visitor, the next question, the next lie. Valerie closed her hand into a fist, trapping the phantom stain inside her grip. She would not wash it away. If she was to be the instrument of justice, then she would carry the mark. It was the price. Michael's blood for her safety, his silence for her voice. A knock came at the door, sharp and imperative, not the nurse's shuffle. This was something else. "Miss Storie," a new voice broke the silence, male and unfamiliar. "Porter with a delivery." He paused, then added, "For your attention." Valerie relaxed her hand, smoothing the sheet over her legs. The moment of private guilt was over. The world was coming back in. "Come in," she said. The door opened, and a man in a grey uniform entered, carrying a large manila envelope. He did not look at her face, keeping his eyes on the bed frame as if afraid to meet the gaze of the invalid. He placed the envelope on the table beside the water jug, the paper thick and official. "Sign here, love," the porter said, producing a clipboard and a stub of pencil. "Special delivery from the DPP, says it's urgent." Valerie reached for the pencil. Her fingers trembled, the spasm returning as she gripped the wood. She scrawled her signature, the letters jagged and uneven. The porter took the clipboard and left without a word, closing the door behind him. Valerie looked at the envelope. It bore the crest of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Inside was the list, the names of the men she would have to look at, the men she would have to choose from, and among them, the one she had already created with her words. She pushed the envelope away, sliding it towards the edge of the table. It teetered there, precarious, ready to fall. The envelope did not fall. It sat on the lip of the table, a tan rectangle defying gravity, waiting for a gust from the window or a tremor in the floorboards to send it crashing to the linoleum. Valerie watched the crease where the flap had been glued. Thick paste, industrial and unyielding, holding secrets that smelled of nothing but paper and the damp wool of the porter's uniform. She could reach it. Her arm functioned from the shoulder down, a working lever attached to a broken chassis, but the effort required to lean forward sent a spike of white-hot fire through the scar tissue in her neck. The pain was a familiar guard dog, barking warnings whenever she overstepped the boundaries of her new, shrunken world. She let the breath out slowly, a hiss through clenched teeth, and willed her torso to stillness. Reaching for the envelope meant accepting its contents. It meant acknowledging that the list inside was real, that men had been rounded up, photographed, and numbered like cattle in a pen. Also, she could point a shaking finger at one of them and seal his fate. If she left it there, teetering on the edge, perhaps the decision would make itself. Perhaps the envelope would slide off, land face down, and she could claim she never saw the names. She could tell Oliver the post had been lost, misfiled, eaten by the rats that scuttled behind the skirting boards at night. A foolish thought. Oliver would not accept lost post. Oliver would bring another envelope, and another, until the pile buried her in the bed. The rain intensified against the glass, a sudden drumming that drowned out the distant traffic and the drip of the washroom tap. It sounded like gravel thrown by an angry hand, relentless and chaotic. Valerie flinched, her good shoulder jerking upward as if to protect her ear from the assault. The noise dragged her back to the A6, to the wet tarmac and the headlights cutting through the mist, the moment when the world had narrowed down to the size of a gun barrel and the smell of wet earth. She needed to know. The curiosity was a parasite, gnawing at her gut, more insistent than the hunger she had ignored since breakfast. With a grunt of effort, she extended her arm. Her fingers brushed the corner of the manila paper, rough against her skin. She hooked her index finger around the edge and pulled. The envelope slid across the polished wood of the bedside table, the friction making a soft scraping sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. It stopped just short of her lap, resting on the white sheet that covered her useless legs. She stared at the crest of the DPP embossed in the corner. The ink was black, sharp, and official, a stamp of authority that turned human tragedy into administrative procedure. Her thumb found the flap. She pressed down, feeling the give of the glue, then tore it open. The sound was sharp, a rip that echoed the tearing of fabric, of skin, of life. She reached inside and pulled out the sheets of paper. They were heavy, bond quality, rustling like dry leaves as she separated them. Photographs. Black and white squares, glossy and stark, faces of men. Some looked defiant, chins raised, eyes challenging the camera lens with a hatred that transcended the paper. Others looked terrified, their mouths slack, eyes wide with the realization that they were being measured for a noose. There were 8 of them, 8 lives reduced to grainy images, arranged in a grid that demanded a selection. Valerie's hand hovered over the top row. Her finger trembled, the spasm returning, vibrating up her forearm like a plucked wire. She moved her finger from left to right, tracing the jawlines, the noses, the set of the eyes. The first man had a scar on his cheek, not the right one. The scar was too high, too clean. The second was younger, barely out of boyhood, with soft features that spoke of a life untouched by violence until now. The third had a heavy brow, a darkness in the gaze that made her stomach turn over. She paused. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against her eardrums. The smell of petrol rose again, phantom and cloying, mixing with the disinfectant until she gagged slightly. She could see the car interior, the flash of the torch, the way the light had caught the sweat on the gunman's upper lip. "Look properly, Miss Storie." Oliver's voice echoed in her head, paternal and demanding. "Take your time. It has to be right." She turned the page. More faces. Men who might have been fathers, sons, brothers. Men who were currently sitting in cold cells, wondering if a paralyzed girl in a London hospital held their life in her hand. They didn't know her. They didn't know the weight of the handkerchief in her palm or the way the rain sounded like gravel. To them, she was a mechanism, a piece of legal machinery designed to process guilt. Her finger stopped on the 4th photograph in the 2nd row. The man had a narrow face, a mouth that seemed permanently set in a sneer, even in stillness. His hair was cropped short, military style, but it was the eyes that held her. They were small, dark, and devoid of any plea for mercy. There was a hardness there, a void where empathy should have been, that mirrored the memory etched into her nervous system. She felt a jolt, electric and sickening, run through her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was him, or it was the man she had decided he must be. The distinction had blurred somewhere between the roadside and the ward, between the shock of the bullet and the safety of the sheets. If she chose him, he would hang. The logic was simple, brutal, and irreversible. The state would take him from his cell, walk him up the steps to the gallows at Pentonville, and drop him through the trapdoor. His neck would break. He would stop breathing, and she would be the one who had pulled the lever remotely with the tap of a finger on a photograph. If she chose no one, the killer remained free. He might come back, he might find her, or he might find someone else, another couple on a lonely road, another night of rain and petrol and blood. The responsibility settled on her shoulders, heavier than the paralysis. It crushed the air from her lungs. She looked at the photograph again. The man's face seemed to shift under her gaze, the features rearranging themselves to match the memory more perfectly, or perhaps the memory was reshaping itself to fit the photograph. Which was the truth, the face in the dark, or the face on the paper? A car horn blared outside, a long, mournful note that cut through the rain. Valerie jumped, the photograph scattering across her lap. One slid off, fluttering to the floor, landing face up. It was the man with the narrow face. He stared up at the ceiling, unblinking, accusing. She leaned over the side of the bed, straining her neck until the muscles screamed, and reached for the fallen picture. Her fingertips grazed the edge, but it was just out of reach. She had to stretch further, risking the pain, risking the fall. Why did she want it? To put it back, to hide it, or to hold it closer, to confirm the choice that had already been made in the dark corners of her mind. The door handle turned. Valerie froze, her hand still extended over the side of the bed, her body twisted in an awkward, painful arc. She had not heard footsteps. She had not heard a knock. The intrusion was silent, sudden, a violation of the fragile solitude she had built around the photographs. The door opened slowly. It was not Mrs. Gable. It was not the porter. Detective Superintendent Oliver stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, rain dripping from the brim onto the clean floor. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been an hour ago, his suit damp and clinging to his broad frame. He did not look at her face immediately. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the photograph lying there, face up, staring at him. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. "I see you've received the brief," Oliver said, his voice low, stripped of its usual paternal warmth. He walked towards the bed, his eyes fixed on the photograph on the floor. "And I see you've found him." Valerie pulled her hand back, curling it into a fist against her chest while saying nothing, for there was nothing to say now that the choice was made and the machine was in motion. Oliver bent down, his joints cracking audibly, and picked up the photograph. He straightened up, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. He looked at the image, then at Valerie, his expression unreadable, a mask of professional duty hiding the cost of what they were about to do. "Are you sure, Valerie?" he asked. The use of her first name was a deliberate weapon, a reminder of the intimacy they shared in this terrible secret. "Once I take this back, there is no going back. The wheels turn very fast now." Valerie looked at the photograph in his hand. She looked at the rain streaking the window. She thought of Michael, cold in his box, and the warm, sticky weight of the handkerchief that would never leave her palm. "Yes," she whispered, the word hung in the air, small and final. "It's him." Oliver nodded once sharply. He placed the photograph back on the pile, squared the stack with precise, mechanical movements, and tucked it under his arm. "Right then," he said, turning towards the door, "I'll have the papers drawn up. The parade is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Be ready." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and looked back at her. For a second, the mask slipped, and she saw the dread in his eyes, the knowledge that he was leading a girl to the gallows just as surely as he was leading a man to the hangman's noose. "Try to sleep, Valerie," he said, his voice rough. "You'll need your strength." He left, the door closed, the latch clicked. Valerie was alone again, but the room felt different now. The air was thinner, charged with the static of a decision executed. She looked at her hands, clean and pale on the white sheet. There was no blood, no stain, but as she flexed her fingers, She felt the phantom weight of the rope, heavy and coarse, burning against her skin. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of London, cleansing nothing. The grey light did not break so much as it seeped into the ward, a thin dilution of night that found the cracks in the plaster and settled upon the iron rails of the bed like dust. Valerie woke not to the sound of a bell, nor the clatter of trolleys in the corridor, but to the familiar grinding ache that resided in the hollow of her shoulder, a phantom weight heavier than the leaden paralysis of her legs. There was a rhythm to the room, the slow intake and exhale of other women who shared this suspended state of recovery, yet she felt isolated by the specific quality of her silence, a vacuum where her lower body should have been sending signals of warmth or cold or the simple pressure of the mattress. When the nurse approached, the starch of her uniform rustled like dry leaves, a sound that triggered an involuntary flinch in Valerie's upper spine, reminding her that she was no longer a person who moved through the world, but an object to be turned, washed, and arranged. "Morning, love," the nurse said, her voice bright with a forced cheerfulness that smelled of carbolic soap and peppermint. "Rough night." Valerie stared at the ceiling where a hairline fracture ran like a lightning bolt, mapping a journey she could no longer take. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp chill that penetrated the single-glazed windows and settled into the bones of the building. She tried to speak, but her throat felt lined with wool, dry and obstructive. "The same," Valerie managed, the words scraping against her palate. Sister Hennessy adjusted the pillow with an efficiency that lacked malice, but offered no comfort, her hands cool and practiced against Valerie's neck. In that moment, Valerie felt the ghost of the handkerchief against her palm, that linen square which no longer existed in the physical world, yet retained the sticky warmth of Michael's blood, a tactile hallucination that anchored her to the bed more securely than any strap or sheet could manage. It was a Tuesday. The calendar on the wall said so, though the days had blurred into a single continuous stretch of white walls and grey skies since August. Today was different. The air in the ward felt tighter, drawn taut like a drum's skin waiting for the strike. "Dr. Swanwick will be along shortly," Hennessy said, smoothing the sheet over Valerie's paralyzed limbs with a brisk tug that sent a shock of meaningless sensation through the dead tissue. "He wants you washed before the gentlemen arrive." Valerie turned her head on the pillow, the movement requiring a deliberate engagement of neck muscles that trembled with the effort. She looked at the nurse, seeing not the woman but the function she served, a caretaker of the evidence rather than the patient. "What time?" Valerie asked. 10 o'clock. Don't you worry about the details, just rest." Rest was a commodity she could not afford, not when the machinery of the law was gearing up outside these walls, grinding towards a conclusion that would leave one man dead and another in a box beneath the earth. Hennessy moved to the washbasin, the water splashing into the enamel bowl with a sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet ward. The smell of the soap was sharp, chemical, failing to mask the underlying scent of illness that permeated the curtains and the floorboards. Valerie closed her eyes, but the darkness behind her lids offered no respite, only the replay of the photographs scattered on her lap the night before, the narrow face staring up from the floor where it had fallen. She had chosen. The words sat in her stomach like a stone, digesting slowly, poisoning the blood. Oliver had asked if she was sure, his voice stripped of its usual paternal warmth, and she had said yes. The machine was in motion now, wheels turning very fast, just as he had warned. There was no going back to the uncertainty, to the state of being merely a victim without the burden of executioner. She was the instrument. The realization did not come as a shock, but as a dull pressure, building behind her eyes until the pain threatened to split the skull. Hennessy wrung out the flannel, steam rising in a thin ribbon towards the ceiling. "Lift your head, dear, just a little." Valerie complied, straining against the gravity that seemed to have doubled in the night. The warm cloth touched her face, wiping away the sweat of sleep, but it could not cleanse the feeling of contamination that had settled on her skin. She thought of Michael, cold in his box, and the warm, sticky weight of the handkerchief that would never leave her palm. His ghost was not supernatural but procedural, appearing in the gaps of her memory where the gunman's face should be clearest. He was the silent accuser in the room, his death the heavy counterweight to her life, ensuring that every breath she took in the convalescent home felt like a theft. "Water's getting cold," Hennessy murmured, dipping the cloth again. "You're shivering." "I'm fine," Valerie said, though her teeth wanted to chatter. "Leave the arms." "Doctor's orders, full wash." The nurse's hand moved down to the sheet covering Valerie's chest, pausing there for a moment before pulling it back. The air hit the skin, cool and exposing. Valerie looked away, focusing on the window where a pigeon had landed on the sill, shaking water from its feathers. The bird looked solid, real, unaffected by the drama unfolding within these brick walls. It pecked at the glass once, twice, then flew off into the smog-choked sky. She envied it, the capacity for flight, the ability to leave the scene without leaving a trace of itself behind. Hennessy worked in silence for a minute, the only sound the wet slap of the flannel against skin and the distant rumble of a bus on the Holloway Road. The vibration traveled through the floorboards, up the bed legs, and into Valerie's spine, a reminder of the city continuing its business regardless of the justice being prepared in this room. "Oliver said you were brave," Hennessy said suddenly, her voice lower, less professional. "Said you're doing a difficult thing." Valerie turned her head back to the nurse, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did he?" "He respects you, we all do." "Respect doesn't warm the bed," Valerie said, the bitterness surprising even her. "And it doesn't bring him back." Hennessy paused, the flannel hovering over Valerie's shoulder. For a second, the mask of professional detachment slipped, revealing a flicker of pity that Valerie found almost intolerable. The nurse dipped the cloth again, scrubbing harder than necessary at a stain on the sheet that wasn't there. "Finish up," Hennessy said, her voice tight. "Get you dressed." Valerie lay still, letting the woman work, her mind drifting back to the photographs, the face she had chosen. The narrow jaw, the dark eyes. Was it the truth, or was it the face the police needed it to be? The doubt was a luxury the state could not afford, and so she had swallowed it, locked it away behind her ribs where it would gnaw at her from the inside. She was no longer Valerie the victim. She was Valerie the witness. A role that required her to sacrifice her own psychological wholeness, to sustain the narrative required for the conviction. The door at the end of the ward creaked open, the sound carrying down the length of the room like a signal. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, distinct from the light tread of the nursing staff. Leather soles on linoleum. Men's voices, low and murmured, discussing paperwork and procedure. Hennessy straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's them." Valerie stared at the ceiling fracture, the lightning bolt that mapped a journey she could not take. She flexed her fingers, clean and pale on the white sheet. There was no blood, no stain, but as she curled her hand into a fist, she felt the phantom weight of the rope, heavy and coarse, burning against her skin. "Sit me up," Valerie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I need to see them come in." Hennessy hesitated, then grabbed the crank handle at the foot of the bed. The metal groaned as the bed began to rise, lifting Valerie towards the door, towards the men who would ask her to confirm the end of a life. The crank turned with a resistance that spoke of rusted gears and overuse, a grinding squeal that tore through the ward's hushed atmosphere like a saw-cutting bone. Hennessy's knuckles whitened around the handle, her shoulders hunching as she applied the leverage required to lift a body that felt, to Valerie, as though it had been filled with wet sand. Up came the head, then the torso, the mattress bunching beneath the sheet as gravity reasserted its claim on Valerie's lower half, dragging the useless legs down while the upper body rose to meet the incoming tide. "Easy," Hennessy breathed, the word catching in her throat as the frame locked into place with a metallic clunk. "Don't slump." Valerie did not slump. She anchored herself against the raised backrest, the pressure digging into her spine, a sharp, welcome pain that grounded her in the physical world. The room tilted slightly, or perhaps it was her vision, the edges of the ward blurring into the grey light before snapping back into focus. They were closer now. Oliver led the way, his raincoat dripping onto the polished floor, leaving a trail of dark spots that vanished almost immediately into the linoleum's pattern. He looked smaller than he had in the photographs, or perhaps the distance between them had shrunk, compressing his authority into something more human, more fragile. Behind him trailed a younger man, a constable clutching a leather portfolio to his chest, as if it contained the crown jewels rather than the notes of a murder investigation. Oliver stopped at the foot of the bed, his eyes flicking from Valerie's face to the nurse and back again. He removed his hat, holding it against his leg, the brim still slick with the London drizzle. "Miss Storie," he said, and his voice lacked the boom of the corridor, reduced now to a murmur that had to compete with the hum of the radiator. "I hope we aren't disturbing your rest." "Rest is a generous word for it," Valerie replied, her tongue feeling thick in her mouth. "You're here for the signature, aren't you, not the chat?" Oliver flinched, a minute tightening around the eyes that betrayed the exhaustion beneath the uniform. He stepped forward, the smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco rolling off him, a scent that triggered a visceral memory of the Vauxhall's interior, of the smoke hanging in the air while Michael drove. "We need to finalize the identification procedure," Oliver said, glancing at Hennessy, who had moved to the side of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her apron. "The magistrate expects the paperwork by noon, just a formality, really, confirming what we discussed yesterday." "Formalities hang men," Valerie said. The words came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the polite fiction of the visit. "Don't dress it up as paperwork, Superintendent. It's a death warrant, my signature on it." The constable shifted his weight, the leather of his portfolio creaking in the silence that followed. Hennessy took a half-step back, her gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling to witness the stripping away of protocol. Oliver sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to deflate his entire posture. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket, the gold nib catching the dull light, and placed it on the small table beside the bed, next to the glass of water and the pile of folded clothes Hennessy had prepared. "It is what it is, Miss Storie," he said, his voice dropping lower, intended only for her, "but without it, the man walks. You know that. You know what he did to Michael and to you." "I know what I saw," she corrected, though the certainty felt brittle, like thin ice over a dark river. "Or what I think I saw, in the dark, with the rain." "The jury will believe you," Oliver said, and there was a desperation in his tone now, a plea for her to play her part in the script he had written. "They need you to be sure, for Michael." Michael, the name hung between them, a ghost summoned to do the heavy lifting of persuasion. Valerie looked at the pen, black and sleek against the white enamel of the table. It looked innocent enough, a simple instrument of ink and metal, yet it felt charged with a lethal potential. To pick it up was to seal the fate of another human being, to translate the chaos of that night on the A6 into the neat, linear logic of the law. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it crossed the gap between the sheet and the table. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the pen, and for a second, she expected to feel the sticky warmth of blood, the phantom sensation of the handkerchief asserting its presence. But there was nothing but the smooth, hard surface of the object. "Give me the paper," she said. Oliver nodded to the constable, who stepped forward with stiff, jerky movements to unfold the document. He spread it on the table, smoothing out the creases with a palm that looked too large, too clumsy for such delicate work. The text was dense, legalistic, filled with clauses and references to statutes that meant nothing to Valerie in the face of the simple question at the heart of it. "Did you see him?" Hennessy moved to adjust Valerie's pillow, her touch gentle, apologetic. "Do you need water?" she whispered. "No," Valerie said. "Just hold the paper steady." The constable pressed his hands down on the corners of the sheet, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Valerie's left shoulder, refusing to meet her gaze. Oliver stood back, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an intensity that felt almost predatory. He needed this. He needed her to be the keystone in the arch he was building, the piece that would hold the weight of the prosecution without cracking. Valerie picked up the pen. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have, as if the ink inside was molten lead. She hovered it over the line where her name was to go, the nib casting a tiny shadow on the white page. The silence in the ward deepened, the other patients seemingly holding their breath, the distant traffic fading into a dull roar that might have been the wind on the hillside. She thought of the lineup again, the men standing there shuffling, avoiding eye contact. The one with the narrow jaw, the dark eyes that seemed to look right through her. Had it been him? Or had it just been the face the police wanted to see, the face that fit the narrative of guilt they had constructed from scraps of evidence and public pressure? Valerie, Oliver said softly, using her first name for the first time, a breach of protocol that felt like a hand on her shoulder. Think of Michael. The guilt surged, hot and acidic, rising in her throat. She swallowed it down. There was no room for doubt here. The state required certainty, and she was the only source of it. To hesitate was to fail the dead. She pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed, dark and permanent, forming the loops and curves of her signature. Valerie Storie. The letters looked foreign, disconnected from the hand that wrote them, as if someone else was signing away a life. When she finished, she lifted the pen and placed it back on the table with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice hollow. Oliver exhaled, a sound of profound relief that he tried to mask by clearing his throat. He reached for the paper, folding it carefully with precise, deliberate movements. "That's it," he said. "Thank you, Miss Storie. You've done your duty." "Duty," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what we are calling it?" Oliver didn't answer. He tucked the folder under his arm and nodded to the constable. "We'll leave you to rest." They turned and walked away, their footsteps receding down the ward, leaving behind the smell of rain and the weight of the decision. Hennessy moved to lower the bed, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the crank. "Leave it," Valerie said. "I want to stay up." Hennessy paused, her hand hovering over the handle. "You'll tire yourself." "I'm already tired," Valerie said, looking towards the window where the smog had thickened, obscuring the sky, turning the afternoon into a premature twilight. "Let me just sit here for a while." She stared at her hand, the one that had held the pen. It looked clean, pale, unmarked. But as she curled her fingers into her palm, she could feel it again, the coarse texture of the rope, the phantom burn of the noose, a sensation that she knew would never truly fade. The machine was in motion now, grinding forward towards its inevitable conclusion, and she was the fuel that kept it running. Outside, a siren wailed, a long, mournful sound that rose and fell in the damp air, marking another crisis in a city full of them. Valerie closed her eyes, but the darkness offered no escape, only the replay of the signature, the ink drying on the page, sealing a fate that was no longer hers to control. "Tea?" Hennessy asked, her voice tentative. "In a minute," Valerie said. "Just give me a minute." She needed to breathe, to find a rhythm that didn't feel like stealing air from a ghost. But the air in the ward felt thin, used up, contaminated by the presence of the law and the weight of the choice she had just made. The pigeon returned to the sill, shaking its feathers, indifferent to the drama inside. It pecked at the glass, a sharp, rhythmic tapping that sounded like a code, a message she couldn't decipher. Valerie watched the bird, envying its simplicity, its ability to fly away from the consequences of its existence. She flexed her fingers again, feeling the phantom rope tighten, a reminder that some things, once touched, never let go. The door at the end of the ward swung shut with a final click, severing the connection to the hallway, to the world of action and judgment. She was alone again, suspended in the grey light, waiting for the tea, for the night, for the hanging that would happen somewhere far away, yet would take place entirely within her. "Make it strong," she said to Hennessy, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to stay awake." Hennessy nodded, turning towards the trolley, her apron rustling like dry leaves. Valerie leaned back against the pillow, the pressure on her spine a constant, grounding ache. She stared at the ceiling fracture, the lightning bolt that mapped a journey she could never take, and waited for the world to turn. Hennessy returned with the cup balanced on a chipped saucer, the china clinking softly against the metal tray as she set it down on the locker beside the bed. Steam rose in a thin, wavering column, carrying the scent of stewed leaves and condensed milk, a smell that belonged to every hospital ward in London and nowhere else. Valerie watched the nurse's hands, roughened by disinfectant and hot water, adjust the handle so it faced the right hand, the only hand that obeyed commands anymore. "Careful now," Hennessy said, her voice dropping to a murmur meant only for the space between the bedrails. "It's hot. I put 2 sugars in, like you usually take." "Usually," Valerie repeated, the word catching on the dryness of her throat. She moved her arm, a slow, deliberate negotiation with gravity that required breath held tight in the chest. The fingers curled around the handle, cold metal against skin that felt too thin, too pale, as if the blood had retreated deeper into the core to protect the vital organs from the shock of the morning. Lifting the cup required a heave of the shoulder, a recruitment of muscles that screamed in protest against the stillness they had been forced to endure. The liquid sloshed, a dark ripple threatening the rim, but she held it steady. "Did they go?" Hennessy asked, not looking up as she straightened the sheet over Valerie's legs, the ones that felt like sandbags sewn into the mattress. "The detectives." "They went." "Good." Hennessy tucked the corner with a sharp tug. "You need rest more than you need questions. They don't see that. They see what they need." Valerie brought the cup to her lips, the heat radiating against her mouth, a sharp contrast to the chill that had settled in her bones since Oliver walked through the door. The tea tasted of tannin and sweetness, a cloying flavor that coated the tongue and did little to wash away the metallic tang of fear. She swallowed, the action laborious, feeling the liquid travel down the esophagus like a stone dropping into a well. Outside, the pigeon shifted its weight on the sill, feathers ruffling against the draft seeping through the sash window. It cooed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated in the quiet room, indifferent to the signature drying on the folder tucked under Oliver's arm. Valerie took another sip, holding the warmth in her mouth before letting it slide down, trying to anchor herself in the physical sensation of being alive, of consuming, of existing in a body that still functioned in part. "You're shaking," Hennessy noted, reaching out to steady the saucer as Valerie lowered the cup. "Let me take that." "I can do it." "I know you can, but you don't have to." Hennessy's grip was firm, accepting the weight without waiting for permission, and placed the cup back on the locker with a click that echoed the pen's earlier descent. "There, save your strength for when the doctor comes rounds." Valerie let her hand fall back to the sheet, the fingers curling inward as if seeking to grasp something that wasn't there. The ink on her thumb had smudged, a dark smear against the pale skin that looked like a bruise or a burn. She rubbed at it with her index finger, but the stain held fast, embedded in the whorls of her fingerprint. It wasn't blood. She knew it wasn't blood. Yet the memory of the handkerchief pressed against Michael's wound, the way the linen had soaked through until it was heavy and slick, rose up to meet the sight of the ink. "Did I do the right thing?" The question slipped out before she could check it, quiet and raw, hanging in the air between the bed and the window. Hennessy paused, her hands stilling on the bedrail. She didn't turn around immediately, her shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. When she faced Valerie, her expression was careful, smoothed of any opinion that might jeopardize her position or offer false comfort. "You did what you had to," Hennessy said finally. "That's all anyone can ask." "Is it?" "It is for now." Hennessy moved to the foot of the bed, adjusting the blanket where it had slipped, her movements efficient and devoid of hesitation. "You lie back. I'll draw the curtains when the light goes. It gets cold in here once the sun drops." Valerie leaned back against the pillow, the pressure on her spine a constant grounding ache. She watched the nurse move away towards the trolley, the wheels squeaking slightly as she pushed it towards the next bed, leaving Valerie alone with the smear of ink and the ghost of the handkerchief. The phantom sensation returned, not on her palm this time, but against her shoulder, where the bullet had entered. A dampness that wasn't sweat, a warmth that wasn't the tea. The pigeon on the sill took flight, beating its wings against the glass once before launching into the grey air of the afternoon. It circled once, a dark speck against the smog, then vanished into the murk over the rooftops. Valerie tracked its disappearance until her eyes burned, the grey light of the ward deepening into the blue of early evening. Shadows began to lengthen across the floor, stretching from the iron bed frames like bars cast upon the linoleum. She flexed her thumb again, rubbing the ink stain until the skin grew red, but the black remained, a permanent mark of the transaction completed an hour ago. Oliver had his signature. The state had its witness, and she had the silence of the ward, the taste of stewed tea, and the knowledge that somewhere in the city, A man was being named for a crime she had seen through a windshield slick with rain. Hennessy returned with a fresh pitcher of water, setting it down without a word, the glass clinking against the metal tray. She glanced at the window, then at the dimming light, and reached for the cord to close the curtains. "Night comes early," Hennessy said, pulling the fabric across with a rustle that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Rest now. I'll be at the station if you need." The curtains closed, severing the view of the sky, enclosing the bed in a box of muted green fabric. Valerie lay in the semi-darkness, the ink stain on her thumb invisible now but present, a weight heavier than the cup she had just held. She listened to the sounds of the ward settling, the coughs, the shifting of sheets, the distant clatter of a trolley in the hallway. "Hennessy," she called out, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the nurse's uniform. The footsteps stopped. "Yes." "Leave the light on, the small one." "For the night." "For the night." Hennessy hesitated, then nodded, though Valerie could barely see the movement in the gloom. "As you wish." The click of the switch brought a single bulb to life above the next bed, casting a weak, yellow glow that barely reached Valerie's pillow. She turned her head towards the wall, where the plaster rose to meet the ceiling fracture. The pain in her shoulder throbbed, a rhythmic pulse that matched the beat of her heart, counting down the hours until the morning, until the trial, until the verdict that would seal them both. She closed her hand into a fist, trapping the ink stain inside, and waited for the sleep that felt like a form of drowning. The small bulb above the neighboring bed did not so much illuminate as it did bruise the darkness, casting a jaundiced pool of light that stopped 3 feet short of Valerie's pillow, leaving her face in a twilight zone where the plaster cracks looked like maps of counties she would never visit again. She lay still, the sheets heavy across her legs, a dead weight that no amount of wishing could shift, while the air in the ward grew thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and the antiseptic sting of carbolic soap, a scent that seemed to coat the back of her throat every time she swallowed. Sleep was not a refuge, but a waiting room, a place where the mind drifted back to the A6, to the rain lashing the windscreen, to the way Michael's voice had cut off mid-sentence, leaving a silence that was louder than the gunshot itself. "Valerie." The voice came from the foot of the bed, low and careful, belonging to Hennessy, who had returned not for the pitcher or the curtains, but because the silence in this ward was rarely absolute, and the sound of a held breath was often the loudest thing in the room. "I'm awake," Valerie said, her tongue feeling too large for her mouth, the words sticking slightly to the roof of her palate like wet paper. Hennessy stepped into the fringe of the yellow light, her uniform stiff and white, the fabric rustling as she moved closer, her hands clasped in front of her apron in a gesture that might have been prayer or simply a way to keep them from fidgeting. "You called out," the nurse said, tilting her head, her eyes scanning the shadows around the bed as if looking for an intruder that only Valerie could see. "I thought you might be in pain." "The shoulder," Valerie admitted, though the pain was a constant companion, a familiar tenant that had moved in and nailed its coat to the wall, rarely leaving even for a moment. "It throbs, like a heartbeat in the wrong place." Hennessy nodded, reaching out to adjust the blanket at the foot of the bed, her fingers brushing the iron rail with a cold, metallic click that echoed in the quiet space. "I can fetch the sister," she offered, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace of the ward. "She has the morphine schedule. We're not supposed to deviate, but—" "No," Valerie said, the word sharper than she intended, cutting through the softness of the nurse's tone. "No morphine, not tonight. It will help you rest." "Rest isn't sleeping," Valerie said, turning her head slightly on the pillow, the friction of the linen against her ear sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Rest is when the noise stops. The drugs just make the noise fuzzy. They don't make it go away." Hennessy paused, her hand hovering over the blanket, her expression shifting from professional concern to something softer, more human, a flicker of understanding that crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "What noise, Valerie?" she asked, her voice barely audible, a thread of sound in the gloom. The car, Valerie said, staring at the ceiling where the shadow of the light bulb danced like a pendulum. The engine, it's always running, even here, even now. Hennessy withdrew her hand, letting it fall to her side, her shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the confession had transferred itself to her own narrow frame. "You should try to eat something," she said after a long pause, deflecting the darkness with the mundane, the practical, the things that could be fixed with a tray and a spoon. "Dinner was poor tonight, but there's some broth left in the kitchen. I could bring you a cup." "I'm not hungry." "You need to keep your strength up," Hennessy insisted, her tone taking on a maternal edge, the kind that brooked no argument, born of long shifts and too many patients who simply gave up. "The trial starts soon," Oliver said. He said they need you sharp. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and unpleasant, like the smell of stale tobacco that clung to the detective's coat, a scent that seemed to have permeated the very walls of the convalescent home. Oliver and his desperate, clawing need for a witness who could point a finger and say him, as if the gesture alone could knit together the fractured pieces of a life that had been blown apart on a muddy verge in Bedfordshire. "Oliver wants what he wants," Valerie said, her voice flat, devoid of the anger she felt, a cold stone sitting in her stomach. "He doesn't care if I'm sharp, he just cares if I'm there." "That's not fair," Hennessy said, though she didn't sound convinced, her gaze dropping to the floor where the linoleum peeled slightly at the corner, revealing the dark wood beneath. "Fairness died on the A6, Valerie muttered, closing her eyes against the yellow light, though the darkness behind her lids was no safer than the room itself. "Leave me, Hennessy, please, just leave me." The nurse hesitated, torn between her duty to care and the instinct to flee from a grief she could not mend, before finally nodding, a slow, reluctant movement of her head. "I'll be at the station," she whispered, stepping back into the shadows, her form dissolving into the gloom until only the sound of her retreating footsteps remained, a soft rhythm on the wooden floor that faded into the distant clatter of a trolley. Valerie lay alone again, the silence rushing back in to fill the space Hennessy had occupied, a silence that was not empty but crowded with the ghosts of the past, the memory of Michael's blood soaking through the linen handkerchief, the feel of the gunmetal cold against her skin, the way the rain had turned the road into a river of black oil. She flexed her thumb, the one stained with ink, feeling the phantom pressure of the pen, the weight of the signature that had sealed a man's fate, a fate that now felt inextricably bound to her own. The pain in her shoulder pulsed, a rhythmic drumbeat that matched the ticking of the clock on the far wall, counting down the seconds until morning, until the court, until the moment she would have to stand up in spirit, if not in flesh, and point to the man in the dock. Somewhere in the city, beyond the thick walls of the ward and the smog-choked streets, a man was sleeping, or perhaps he was pacing, or perhaps he was staring at a ceiling just like hers, wondering when the knock would come. She didn't know his name, not really, not the way she knew Michael's, but she knew his face, or at least the version of it she had constructed from flashes of light and terror, a face that would soon be drawn in charcoal and displayed for the world to judge. The bulb above the next bed flickered, a brief stutter in the current that sent a shiver of unease through her, as if the electricity itself was faltering under the strain of the night. She turned her head towards the wall again, pressing her cheek against the cool pillowcase, seeking a comfort that wasn't there, a silence that wouldn't come. The ink stain on her thumb felt hot now, burning like a brand, a mark of Cain that she could not wash away, no matter how hard she scrubbed. "Hennessy," she whispered again, but the nurse was gone, and the word died in the air, unanswered, joining the other voices in the ward, the coughs, the moans, the prayers muttered in the dark. She closed her hand into a fist, hiding the stain, hiding the evidence, hiding the truth that she carried in her broken body, a truth that was messy and uncertain and terrified her more than the gun ever had. The rain began to fall outside, a soft tapping against the window pane, a sound that grew louder, insistent, until it drowned out the clock, the traffic, the breathing of the other patients, until it was the only sound in the world, washing over her, through her, carrying her back to the car, to the road, to the moment everything changed. And in that deluge, she waited, suspended between the living and the dead, between the victim and the witness, between the woman who wanted to forget and the instrument the state required her to be. The night stretched out before her, long and endless, a dark road with no turning, leading only to the dawn and the courtroom and the terrible, irrevocable act of naming. The rain did not tap, it scraped, a wet fingernail dragging down the pane, seeking a purchase that the grime of London denied it. Valerie kept her hand clenched, the knuckles white against the sheet, hiding the thumb that felt branded by an ink which had long since dried. The stain was gone, washed away by Hennessy's rough soap and the basin water, yet the skin there burned with a heat that no amount of scrubbing could cool. It was a phantom brand, a mark of complicity that sat deeper than the dermis, rooting itself in the bone. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of the smog, a yellow-grey blanket that choked the street lamps and turned the world into a suffocating cave. Somewhere out there, beyond the glass and the iron rails and the thick brick walls of the convalescent home, James Hanratty was sleeping or pacing or staring at a ceiling much like this one, unaware that a paralyzed woman in a ward full of coughing strangers held the power to pull the trapdoor from beneath his feet. She did not know him, not truly. She knew only the shadow that had leaned over the back seat, the glint of steel, the voice that had sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer, harsh and devoid of mercy. That voice belonged to a monster, a creature of pure malice that existed only in the fractured reels of her memory, yet soon it would be given a name, a face, a history, and a noose. The distinction between the man and the memory blurred, dissolving in the damp heat of the ward. Was she saving herself by naming him, or was she killing a stranger to appease the hunger of the state? The questions circled her mind like a fly trapped in a jar, buzzing against the glass, frantic and pointless. Oliver wanted certainty. The court wanted a narrative. The public wanted a villain to hang so they could sleep soundly in their beds, convinced that evil was something that could be identified, isolated, and removed. They did not want the messy truth, the trembling doubt, the way the darkness on the A6 had swallowed everything whole, leaving only confusion and blood. She uncurled her fingers slowly, one by one, as if releasing a bird that might bite. The thumb lay exposed, pale and unmarked, lying useless against the palm. No ink, no blood, just skin. Yet the weight of it remained, a leaden pressure that dragged her arm down towards the mattress. If she refused, if she sat silent in the dock and shook her head when Swanwick asked the question, what then? The case would crumble. The man would walk. And she would be left here, alone in this room with the ghost of Michael Gregston, knowing that she had let his killer go free because she was too afraid to be wrong. The guilt of that inaction would be a heavier burden than the guilt of a wrongful conviction, she told herself, repeating the mantra until the words lost their meaning and became just sounds, hollow clicks in the dark. A door slammed further down the corridor, the noise sharp and sudden, cracking the stillness like a whip. Footsteps approached, heavier than Hennessy's, confident, rhythmic, the sound of boots that knew exactly where they were going. Oliver, he did not knock, he never knocked, acting as if the ward belonged to him, as if her body were just another piece of evidence to be catalogued and stored. The handle turned, the latch clicking with a precision that made her teeth ache, and the door swung open to admit a gust of cold air that smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of the street. He filled the doorway, a large man in a rain-slicked mackintosh, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto the linoleum floor. His face was flushed, the skin ruddy from the chill outside, but his eyes were sharp, darting around the room before settling on her with a focus that felt physical, a hand pressing against her chest. He did not look like a man who cared about her comfort. He looked like a man who was terrified of losing his prize. "Miss Storie," he said, his voice low, trying for gentle but landing somewhere between command and plea. "I thought you'd be asleep." "Sleep is a luxury," she replied, her throat dry, the words scraping out like gravel. "One I seem to have lost." Oliver stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sealed them in together. He pulled a chair from the foot of the bed, the legs screeching against the floor, a harsh protest that made her flinch. He sat down, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding something fragile inside them. The smell of him was overwhelming, a mix of rain and cheap tobacco and the sour scent of fear that clung to him despite his best efforts to hide it. "We have the lineup arranged for tomorrow morning," he said, watching her face, searching for any crack in her composure. Swanwick is confident, the brief is solid, but he needs you, Valerie, he needs you to be sure. Surety is a strange thing, Superintendent, she murmured, turning her head to look at the window where the rain continued its relentless assault. It comes and goes like the tide. How can I be sure of anything when I can barely remember the color of the sky that night? You remember him, Oliver insisted, his voice hardening, the paternal mask slipping to reveal the desperate man beneath. You remember the voice, the eyes, that's enough. The law doesn't require perfection, just honesty. You tell them what you saw and we do the rest. And if what I saw was a trick of the light, she asked, the question hanging in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. If the face I see in my dreams is not the face of the man you have in custody, what then, Oliver? Do you hang the wrong man just to keep the peace? He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw, a flicker of doubt in his eyes that he quickly suppressed. We have the right man. The evidence points to him. Your identification is the final piece of the puzzle, nothing more. Don't torture yourself with doubts that aren't yours to carry. That's my job. That's the job of the court. My doubts are all I have left, she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming of the rain. They are the only thing that proves I am still alive. Oliver stood up abruptly, the chair scraping again, the noise jarring in the small room. He paced to the window, staring out at the blackness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. For a moment he looked old, tired, the weight of the investigation pressing down on his shoulders, bending his spine. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing, that he was the protector, the father figure guiding a broken girl towards justice. But deep down, in the quiet places he refused to visit, he knew the truth. He was building a gallows, and she was the one who would have to pull the lever. Get some rest, he said, his back to her, his voice flat, devoid of the earlier warmth. The car will be here at 8, don't make us wait. He left without looking back, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone once more with the silence and the rain and the burning sensation on her thumb. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick with the unspoken threat of the morning to come. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, tracing the crack that ran like a lightning bolt across the plaster, mapping a journey she could not take. Tomorrow she would have to choose. Tomorrow she would have to point a finger and seal a fate, knowing that whatever she chose, a part of her would die with the decision. The rain hammered on, a relentless rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart, counting down the seconds until the dawn, until the court, until the moment the world would demand a sacrifice. And she knew, with a terrible, sinking certainty, that she would give it to them. She would give them whatever they wanted, even if it cost her soul. The door latch clicked, a finality sharper than the rain against the pane, severing the connection between the ward and the wet world outside. Darkness rushed back in to fill the space Oliver had occupied, thick and suffocating, smelling still of his damp Macintosh and the anxiety he tried to mask with authority. She lay rigid, the sheets tucked tight around her paralyzed legs like a shroud prepared too early, trapping the heat until her skin prickled with a sweat she could not wipe away. 8 o'clock. The time hung in the room, a tangible weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a laborious negotiation with her own ribs. Outside, a lorry gears down on the main road, the engine roaring like a distressed animal before fading into the drone of the city's night pulse. She turned her head on the pillow, the starch-stiff case scratching her cheek, and fixed her gaze on the small table beside the bed where a glass of water sat untouched, the surface trembling slightly with the vibration of passing traffic. It was the only thing in the room that moved. Her hands, resting atop the quilt, looked pale and alien in the gloom, fingers curled slightly inward, as if trying to grasp something that had slipped through them weeks ago on a muddy verge in Bedfordshire. Michael's voice echoed in the hollow of her skull, not a memory but a presence, sharp and clear despite the distance of death. Don't worry, Val, just a bit of trouble. He had said it with that easy confidence, the kind that belonged to men who believed the world operated on rules they understood, rules that did not include random violence or the cold eye of a stranger with a gun. That confidence had got him killed. It had left her here, broken and bound to a bed, while his body cooled in a mortuary slab, waiting for her to give his killer a name. Or a face. The distinction mattered less now than the necessity of the act. Oliver wanted certainty. The court required a spectacle. The public demanded a villain to hang so the streets might feel safe again. They needed her to be the lens through which the blurred chaos of that night focused into a single, prosecutable image. If she failed, if she hesitated, the narrative would collapse, and the man they held in custody might walk free, carrying the secret of what he had done back into the shadows of London. But if she succeeded, she condemned a man to the rope, based on a memory that felt increasingly like a fabrication of her own trauma. She shifted her shoulder, wincing as the movement pulled at the scar tissue beneath her nightdress. The pain was real, at least. It was the only anchor she had left in a sea of doubt. What then, Oliver? The question she had asked him circled back, biting at her thoughts. Do you hang the wrong man? She did not know the answer. She did not know the face of the shooter anymore. The image in her mind was a composite of fear and flashbulb afterimages, a distortion created by the shock of the bullet tearing through her spine. Was it the man Oliver had shown her in the photographs, the one with the sullen eyes and the too thin lips? Or was it someone else entirely, a ghost who had vanished into the fog while the police chased down the first plausible suspect they could find? It did not matter. That was the terrible truth settling over her like the damp chills seeping through the window frame. The truth of what happened on Deadman's Hill was dead with Michael. What remained was the truth the state required, a construct built from testimony and procedure, and she was the cornerstone. Without her identification, the structure fell. With it, a man died. Her right hand twitched, the fingers spasming against the wool of the blanket. She stared at them, willing them to still, but they moved with a life of their own, a nervous system firing signals into a void. It felt like a betrayal. Her body, which had failed to protect Michael, which had failed to stop the gunman, was now failing to obey her even in this small act of rest. A clock ticked somewhere in the corridor, a steady, mechanical heartbeat counting down the hours until morning. Dig. 1 hour closer to the car. Dig. 1 hour closer to the line of men standing behind the glass. She closed her eyes, but the darkness behind her lids offered no refuge. Instead, it projected the scene she dreaded most. The parade room, the cold light, the row of strangers shuffling into place, all waiting for her finger to rise and point. She could feel the weight of their lives in her hand, heavy and slick, like the handle of a gun she had never held. If she pointed at the wrong one, his blood would be on her hands as surely as Michael's was. If she pointed at the right one, she became the instrument of his execution. There was no escape. Oliver had made sure of that. He had wrapped the coercion in concern, draped the demand in the language of duty, but the message was clear. Don't make us wait. It was not a request. It was an order from a man who needed her compliance to justify his own actions, to validate the weeks of investigation, the arrests, the pressure from above. He needed her to be sure so he could sleep at night. And she needed to survive, not just the physical survival of breath in her lungs, but the survival of the self that remained. If she refused, they would find another way. They would twist her uncertainty into confusion, her doubt into hysteria, until her testimony was worthless anyway. They would paint her as a hysterical woman, unreliable, damaged goods, and the real killer would slip away while she rotted in this ward, forgotten. So she had to choose. Not between truth and lies, but between two versions of a nightmare. She opened her eyes again, staring at the crack in the ceiling. It looked like a river on a map, a route leading nowhere, branching into smaller fissures that disappeared into the plaster. She traced it with her mind, following its jagged path until it blurred into the darkness. Tomorrow, she would travel a different road. She would be wheeled into the court or the police station, and she would look through the glass. And when the time came, she would raise her hand. She had to. For Michael, for the justice that demanded a price, for the peace that Oliver promised but could not deliver. The rain intensified, hammering against the glass with a violence that shook the frame, drowning out the distant traffic, drowning out the ticking clock. It sounded like applause, or perhaps jeering. It was hard to tell in the dark. She moved her hand again, this time deliberately, sliding it across the sheet until her fingertips brushed the cold rim of the water glass. The condensation wet her skin, a shock of chill that made her gasp. She gripped the glass, her knuckles white, holding on as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Tomorrow. The word echoed in the silence, a verdict already passed. She took a sip of the water, the liquid cool and tasteless, doing nothing to quench the dryness in her throat. She set the glass back down, the clink of it against the table sounding loud in the quiet room. Then she folded her hands back onto the quilt, interlacing her fingers to stop them from shaking, and waited for the dawn to break over London, bringing with it the grey light of judgment. The storm outside raged on, but inside the ward, the silence was absolute, a held breath waiting to be exhaled in a single fatal gesture. She lay still, her eyes open, watching the shadows lengthen and shift as the night wore on, counting the seconds until she would have to become the thing they needed her to be. The witness, the judge, the executioner. And there was no going back. The rain did not fall so much as it pressed, a wet thumb smearing the grime of London against the pane until the street lamps below bled into yellow bruises. Inside the ward, the air held a different weight, thick with the scent of boiled cabbage and the sharp, medicinal tang of carbolic soap that clung to the sheets like a second skin. Valerie lay still, though her mind raced through the corridors of the home, bumping against walls that were not there, searching for a door that had been locked since August. She needed the handkerchief, not the one in the evidence bag, sealed in plastic and labeled with a case number that felt too clean for what it contained, but the phantom linen square that lived in the nerve endings of her right palm. It was there again, that damp, sticky warmth seeping through her nightdress, a tactile hallucination more real than the quilt tucked around her paralyzed legs. "Miss Storie." The voice came from the doorway, low and careful, as if speaking to a frightened animal that might bolt if startled. Valerie did not turn her head. The movement required a coordination she no longer possessed, a negotiation between will and muscle that always ended in failure. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling crack, the jagged lightning bolt of plaster that mapped a journey she could never take. "Miss Storie, are you awake?" It was Oliver. Of course it was Oliver. He smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco, a combination that spoke of long nights in unheated cars and rooms where men smoked to keep the dread at bay. He stepped further into the room, his shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum, a sound that grated against the silence of the sleeping ward. The other women in their iron beds remained still, their breathing rhythmic and deep, feigning a slumber they did not feel to avoid the intrusion of official business. "I am awake," Valerie said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the resonance it once held, like a wire stretched too tight. "There is little else to be." Oliver moved to the foot of the bed, his silhouette blocking the faint light from the corridor. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deepened by the strain of a case that was slipping through his fingers like smoke. He needed her to hold still. He needed her to be the anchor that kept the entire investigation from drifting out to sea. "We have the arrangements for tomorrow," he said, his hands clasped behind his back, a gesture of formality that did nothing to hide the tension in his shoulders. "The parade is set for 10, at the station." Valerie felt the ghost of the blood on her hand again, a sudden spike of heat that made her fingers twitch against the quilt. She remembered the Vauxhall, the smell of cordite mixing with the scent of Michael's cologne, the way the world had tilted on its axis when the first shot rang out. That memory was a living thing, coiled in her gut, waiting to strike. 10, she repeated, the word tasted like ash, "and if I am not ready." "You will be ready." It was not a question, nor was it a command spoken with anger. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weary certainty of a man who had already written the outcome in his notebook. "The car will be here at 9:30. Driver has instructions to take the back entrance." Valerie shifted her gaze slowly, dragging it across the room until it landed on Oliver's face. In the dim light, he looked older than he had in the photographs the papers printed, a man carrying the weight of a noose he hoped never to tie himself. He avoided her eyes, looking instead at the water glass on the table beside her, at the condensation beading on the surface like sweat. "Superintendent," she said, the title feeling heavy on her tongue. "Do you know what it feels like to decide who dies?" Oliver flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his jaw. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a packet of players, then thought better of it and shoved it back. The gesture was telling. Even he knew the rules of this place, where smoke was contraband and silence was the only currency that held value. "It is not for you to decide, Valerie," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that felt like a violation. "It is for you to identify the rest. The rest is for the court, for the judge." "The court does not sit in the back of a car," she whispered. "The court does not smell the blood." "No," Oliver agreed, his voice dropping to a murmur as he conceded the point. "It does not, but we need you to tell us what you saw, and we need you to be sure." Sure, the word hung in the air, a demand that ignored the fractured nature of her memory, the way trauma splintered time into disjointed shards that refused to fit together. How could she be sure when the face of the shooter was obscured by shadow and fear? When every time she closed her eyes, she saw Michael's slack expression, the way his head had lolled against the window as the life drained out of him. "I will do what you ask," she said, the words tasting bitter, "but do not mistake my compliance for certainty." Oliver nodded, a quick, jerky motion. He seemed relieved, as if her agreement absolved him of some portion of the guilt he carried. He turned to leave, his hand already reaching for the door handle, eager to escape the confines of her suffering. "Get some rest," he called back, not looking at her. "It will be a long day." The door clicked shut, sealing her once more in the grey quiet of the ward. Valerie lay alone with the sound of the rain and the phantom stain on her hand. She moved her fingers, spreading them wide against the white quilt, trying to wipe away the sensation of warmth that was not there. It did not work. The stain was part of her now, woven into the fabric of her skin, a permanent mark of the transaction that had taken place on Deadman's Hill. She thought of the line of men waiting for her tomorrow. Strangers pulled from the cells, from the streets, chosen for their height or their build or the color of their hair. They would stand behind the glass, shuffling their feet, avoiding her gaze, knowing that one of them might walk out a condemned man because of her. And she would sit in her chair, paralyzed and broken, and point a finger that felt heavier than lead. Michael's absence yawned in the room, a silence so loud it drowned out the traffic below. He was the unseen driver, the ghost in the machine, accusing her with every breath she took. She had survived, and he had not, and the imbalance of it was a physical pain in her chest. Valerie closed her eyes, but the darkness offered no refuge. Instead, it brought the scene forward, sharp and unblurred. The flash of the gun, the smell of oil, the way the rain had washed the blood into the gutter. She saw the face of the man who had pulled the trigger, clear as day, yet slippery as an eel when she tried to grasp it. Was it him? Was it the one Oliver wanted it to be? Or was it someone else entirely, a shadow that had slipped away while the law chased a phantom? It did not matter. The machine was already in motion, grinding forward with a momentum that could not be stopped by doubt or hesitation. She was a cog in the mechanism, a witness required to validate the narrative. If she faltered, the whole structure might collapse, leaving Michael's death unavenged, his killer free to walk the streets of London. She could not let that happen. Even if it meant condemning a man who might be innocent. Even if it meant selling her soul to keep the promise of justice alive. Valerie opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling crack again. It seemed to have grown longer in the darkness, branching out towards the corners of the room like roots seeking water. She traced its path with her mind, following it until it disappeared into the shadows. Tomorrow, she would follow a different path. She would be wheeled into the station, placed before the glass, and she would make her choice. The rain continued to batter the window, a relentless rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart. She focused on the sound, letting it fill the silence, letting it drown out the whispers of doubt that crept into the edges of her mind. There was no going back. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but she had to travel it, for Michael, for the peace that might never come. She moved her hand again, this time gripping the edge of the quilt, her knuckles white against the fabric. The phantom warmth of the blood faded, replaced by the cold reality of the cotton beneath her fingers. It was a small comfort, but it was something real, something she could hold on to. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, she would be ready, or she would pretend to be, which, in the end, amounted to the same thing. The clock in the corridor ticked on, counting down the seconds until morning, until the parade, until the moment her finger would rise and seal a fate. Valerie listened to it, each tick a hammer blow against the silence, marking the time until she became the instrument of justice. And the rain washed the streets of London clean, hiding the sins of the city under a layer of grey water, waiting for the sun to reveal them once more. The clock in the corridor did not tick so much as it clicked, a dry, mechanical bone snap that measured out the shrinking distance between now and the morning. Each sound drove a spike into the quiet, counting down the seconds until she would be wheeled out, displayed, and asked to perform the act of condemnation. Valerie lay rigid, the sheet pulled up to her chin, feeling the coarse weave scratch against her jawline like a poor imitation of comfort. The rain had softened to a drizzle, tapping against the glass with the tentative fingers of a beggar, yet the dampness seeped through the window frame regardless, carrying the smell of wet coal dust and exhaust fumes that define London in October. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat, thick and greasy, reminding her of the Vauxhall's interior, of the oil and the cordite, and the copper tang of blood that had filled her lungs before the paralysis took hold. She tried to shift her left leg, a reflex born of 40 years of habit, but the limb remained a dead weight, a slab of cold meat strapped to the bed frame. No signal arrived, no spark fired, just the hollow echo of a command sent into a void where nerves used to be. Frustration curled in her gut, hot and acidic, but she swallowed it down, knowing that anger would only tighten the muscles in her shoulders, making the pain worse when the nurse returned to turn her. Instead, she focused on her right hand, the one that still obeyed, flexing the fingers until the knuckles cracked. This hand would have to do the work tomorrow. This hand would point. The thought made her stomach lurch, a physical recall from a future she could not avoid. "Sleep," she whispered to the empty room, the word cracking in her dry throat. Just sleep. But sleep was a country she could no longer visit without a visa of exhaustion, and tonight her mind was too sharp, too eager to dissect the horrors waiting in the daylight. She imagined the identification room at the police station, a space she had never seen but could construct in vivid detail from Oliver's descriptions. The harsh electric lights, the one-way glass, the row of men standing shoulder to shoulder like cattle in a pen. Would they look at her? Would they know? The idea of 6 strangers staring through the glass, knowing that her finger held the power to send one of them to the gallows, made her skin crawl with a sensation that had nothing to do with the chill of the ward. They would be scared. They would be angry. And one of them, perhaps the wrong one, would be guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or having a face that resembled a ghost. Michael's voice drifted into her head, unbidden, a fragment of a conversation from weeks ago about buying a new coat for the winter. He had laughed then, a warm, rich sound that seemed to fill the car, pushing back the shadows. Now that laughter was a relic, buried under the weight of the investigation, overwritten by the stern, legalistic tones of Swanwick and the paternalistic murmurs of Oliver. She missed the sound of him more than she missed the use of her legs. The paralysis was a physical state, but his absence was a gaping wound in the fabric of her reality, a hole through which all the warmth of her life was draining away. If she picked the wrong man, she betrayed that memory. If she picked the right man, she became the agent of his death, and the blood on her hands would never wash off, no matter how many times she scrubbed them with the harsh yellow soap the hospital provided. A floorboard creaked in the corridor, the sound of a night porter shifting his weight, and Valerie held her breath, listening to the rhythm of footsteps fading away. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. She turned her head slightly, straining to see the door, though the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to have deepened, pooling around the base of the wardrobe like spilled ink. In the dim light filtering from the street lamp outside, the hairline crack in the ceiling looked less like a lightning bolt and more like a river map, tracing a course from the head of her bed to the foot, a journey she could never take. It was a cruel joke, this mapping of distances she could no longer traverse, a constant reminder that her world had shrunk to the dimensions of a single room, while the machinery of justice ground on outside, indifferent to her confinement. She thought of the handkerchief again, the linen square that existed only in her mind now, stained with the rust-color bloom of Michael's life. It felt heavy in her palm, damp and sticky, a tactile hallucination that refused to fade no matter how tightly she clenched her fist. Was it guilt, or was it just the memory of touch, the last physical connection to a man who was gone? She opened her hand, spreading the fingers wide against the quilt, staring at the pale skin in the gloom. There was no stain there, just the lines of her palm, the callus on her middle finger from holding a pen, the mundane geography of a body that had survived when it should not have. Yet the sensation persisted, a ghost weight pressing down, anchoring her to the bed, to the crime, to the terrible burden of being the sole witness to a murder that demanded a sacrifice. "Who is it?" she asked the darkness, her voice barely a whisper. "Who stands behind the glass?" The room offered no answer, only the rhythmic drip of a tap in the washroom down the hall, a slow, maddening percussion that seemed to sync with the beating of her own heart. Thump, drip, thump, drip. As the sound drilled into her skull, wearing away at her resolve and stripping back the layers of composure she had built up over the last few weeks, she felt raw and exposed, like a nerve ending rubbed bare. She wanted to scream, to shatter the quiet with a noise that would express the sheer, unadulterated terror of what she was about to do, but the sound died in her throat, choked off by the fear of waking the other women, of drawing attention to her weakness. Weakness was a luxury she could not afford. Tomorrow she had to be strong, certain, the instrument the state required her to be. Valerie shifted her gaze to the window, where the rain had started again, streaking the glass with silver trails that distorted the orange glow of the street lamp into something alien and warped. The city outside was asleep, or pretending to be, wrapped in its fog and its secrets, unaware that a paralyzed woman in a convalescent home was wrestling with the fate of a man she had seen for only a few terrifying minutes in the dark. It seemed impossible that so much could hinge on her memory, on the fragile, fractured recollections of a victim who still flinched at the sound of a slamming door. Yet here she was, the pivot point upon which the entire case balanced, the linchpin in a machine designed to extract a verdict regardless of the cost to her soul. She closed her hand into a fist again, gripping the quilt until her knuckles turned white, holding on to the fabric as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly dissolving into uncertainty. The phantom warmth of the blood surged back, stronger this time, seeping through the cotton, staining her nightdress with a heat that was not there. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to force the image of Michael's smiling face to replace the vision of the gun, but the darkness behind her eyelids was crowded with shadows, with the faces of men she did not know, with the looming presence of the gallows at Pentonville. There was no escape, no reprieve. The road led only one way, and she was already halfway down it, hurtling towards a destination she could not change. Sentence 1. The clock clicked again, louder this time, a sharp admonition that time was running out. Keep mostly same, maybe tweak for flow. Sentences 2-5, the problem area, morning was coming, the detectives would return, the car would be waiting, and she would have to choose. Need to combine or subordinate some of these to avoid the 4-short string. Option A, morning was coming and... The Deadman's Hill Confessional is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. The A6 Murder Rene v. James Hanratty, The Semblance of Truth, Internet Archive. Murder and Madness, Internet Archive. Michael Sherrod and the Ghost of James Hanratty, Internet Archive. James Hanratty. Graham Swanwick. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.